The ocean gave no warning. It rarely did. Somewhere east of Guadalcanal, beneath skies that looked no different from any other Pacific morning, fleets began to move toward one another without ever fully knowing where the other was. There would be no lines of battle drawn within sight, no dramatic convergence of ships on the horizon. What unfolded instead was a fight shaped by distance, timing, and decisions made far away from the moment of impact. This was the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, a battle fought almost entirely through aircraft, radios, and judgment. By August of 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a fragile phase. The United States had landed on Guadalcanal, breaking Japan's strategic momentum for the first time. But the landing was only a beginning, and the airfield, later known as Henderson Field, was incomplete, vulnerable, and constantly threatened. Whoever controlled the skies above it would control whether the invasion lived or died. Both sides understood this clearly. Japanese naval forces moved south with the intention of isolating the island and destroying American carrier strength in the process. The U.S. Navy, still rebuilding and still learning how to fight a carrier war, moved to intercept, knowing that losing carriers here could undo everything achieved ashore. What made the Eastern Solomons different was uncertainty. Search planes flew long arcs over empty water. Reports arrived late or incomplete. Contacts were misidentified. Fleets maneuvered based on fragments of information, committing aircraft to strikes against targets that might already have moved or never existed at all. And yet, when contact was made, the consequences were immediate. Aircraft rose from decks hundreds of miles apart and crossed paths unseen. Pilots searched vast stretches of ocean with fuel ticking away. Attacks were launched on instinct and imperfect intelligence. Bombs found ships. Ships burned. Aircraft were lost not just to enemy fire, but to distance and exhaustion, forced to ditch into open water when fuel ran dry. This was not a battle of annihilation. It was a battle of denial. The Japanese sought to destroy American carriers outright. The Americans sought to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal. Neither side achieved total victory, but one side achieved something far more important. The Japanese advance was stopped. Carrier decks were damaged. Air groups were depleted. Momentum slipped away. The Japanese fleet withdrew, leaving Guadalcanal still supplied, still contested, still alive. The battle did not end the campaign, but it ensured it would continue on American terms. What mattered at the Eastern Solomons was not how many ships sank. It was what did not happen. The invasion was not isolated. Henderson Field survived. The initiative did not return to Japan. The battle revealed the nature of the Pacific War, as it would now be fought, at range, through aviation, logistics, and endurance rather than decisive surface engagements. It showed how fragile carrier warfare could be, and how quickly advantage could shift based on a handful of decisions made under pressure. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons did not announce itself as a turning point. It simply tilted the war, quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. It proved that the Pacific conflict would be decided not by bold single strikes, but by repeated contests where control was earned, lost, and fought over again. It showed that victory could be measured not only in destruction, but in persistence. This is the story of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where the war over Guadalcanal was kept alive, where the sky replaced the sea as the true battlefield, and where the Pacific War took another irreversible step toward a different balance of power. Before you move on, pause for a moment and notice where you are. Is this a quiet stretch of time, or something you're fitting in between obligations? Is the light around you fading, brightening, or holding steady? And what hour has carried you into this moment? The Eastern Solomons were fought across distances that stretched patience and perception. Let this story meet you wherever you are, without rushing past what matters. May 7th, 1942. The conference room inside the Japanese fleet headquarters at Rabaul smelled of cigarette smoke and salt air. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific, his fingers tracing the vast blue expanse between Tokyo and the Solomon Islands. Before him lay scattered reports from the Coral Sea engagement, the first naval battle in history where opposing fleets never glimpsed each other's hulls. His staff officers watched in silence as he read through casualty figures, aircraft losses, and damage assessments. The numbers told a story that contradicted the triumphant communiques being broadcast across the empire. Japan had stopped the American advance toward Port Moresby, yes, but at a cost no one had anticipated. The admiral's hand paused over a cluster of small islands running southeast from New Guinea. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, San Cristobal. Names that meant nothing to most Japanese citizens, but everything to the strategists planning the empire's next moves. For 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, claiming victory after victory with methodical precision. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, the British fortress once deemed impregnable, had surrendered. 14 consecutive victories between December 7th, 1941, and the end of April 1942 had convinced many in Tokyo that the war was already won. But Yamamoto knew better. He had studied in America, walked the streets of Washington and Boston, seen the factories and oil refineries stretching across a continent. The victories were real, but so was the timer counting down to Japan's inevitable reckoning. The Coral Sea engagement had revealed something troubling. American carrier pilots, though less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, had fought with unexpected tenacity. The light carrier Shoho had been sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku damaged badly enough to require months of repairs. More concerning than the ships lost were the pilots who would never return. 53 aircraft destroyed, 77 aircrew dead or missing. These were men who had trained for years, who knew their aircraft like extensions of their own bodies, who could land on a carrier deck in darkness with waves crashing over the bow. Japan's Naval Aviation Academy at Kasumigara could produce new aircraft in weeks, but it needed years to forge pilots of this caliber. Yamamoto pulled a folder from the stack on his desk and opened it to reveal reconnaissance photographs of an unfinished airstrip on Guadalcanal. The Americans were building something there, though intelligence remained unclear about its purpose or timeline. His strategic staff had been arguing for weeks about Operation FS, the planned seizure of Fiji and Samoa. Success would sever the supply line between America and Australia, potentially forcing the Australians out of the war entirely. But Fiji lay beyond Japan's operational radius of 1,200 nautical miles from the nearest base. Every mile stretched the supply chain thinner, exposed convoys to submarine attack, pulled destroyers and cruisers away from fleet protection duties. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo wanted dramatic conquests that would impress the public and intimidate neutrals into accepting Japan's co-prosperity sphere. Yamamoto wanted victories that could be sustained, positions that could be defended, strategies that acknowledged America's industrial capacity. The United States was building 2 Essex-class fleet carriers every year. Japan was building 1. Simple mathematics suggested how this story would end if the war continued too long. A junior officer entered carrying fresh intelligence summaries from submarine reconnaissance missions. American activity around Guadalcanal had intensified. Construction crews were visible from offshore. Supply ships were making regular runs. Something was happening there, something the Americans considered important enough to risk ships and men in waters Japan considered its own. Yamamoto understood the calculus immediately. If the Americans completed an airfield on Guadalcanal, they would control the air over the southern Solomons. If they controlled the air, they could attack Japanese shipping moving south from Rabaul. If Japanese shipping could not reach the Solomons, the entire Southwest Pacific strategy would collapse. Operation FS became irrelevant in an instant. The Solomon Islands, previously considered a backwater, had just become the most critical strategic position in the Pacific. He turned to his operations officer and began issuing orders. The 2nd and 3rd fleets would be concentrated for a major operation to secure Guadalcanal and establish a strong defensive perimeter throughout the Solomons. Transport ships would carry construction battalions to complete the airfield before the Americans could seize it. Fighter squadrons would provide air cover. Heavy cruisers would bombard any American positions. The operation would commence in early July, giving the fleet time to reassemble after the Coral Sea engagement. On paper, the plan looked straightforward. Japan still possessed overwhelming naval superiority in the region. The American Pacific Fleet remained crippled from Pearl Harbor. The British had withdrawn from the Indian Ocean after losing 2 carriers to Japanese air attack. Who could stop the Imperial Navy from taking a cluster of sparsely populated tropical islands? But Yamamoto's diary from this period reveals his private doubts. The war will be decided not by battleships, but by whoever controls the air, he wrote on May 15th. The Coral Sea had proven that carrier aviation would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Battleships, those floating fortresses that had dominated naval thinking for centuries, were now little more than expensive targets. Aircraft could strike from beyond visual range, appear from any direction, overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington at Coral Sea, but they had bloodied the Japanese carrier fleet in return. More importantly, they had demonstrated that American pilots could challenge Japanese air superiority. This was the vulnerability Yamamoto could not discuss with his staff, could barely acknowledge to himself. Every carrier battle from this point forward would consume irreplaceable veteran pilots. Every engagement would train American aircrew in combat tactics. Every month that passed would see American factories producing more aircraft, while Japan struggled to maintain current production levels. The reconnaissance photos showed American positions on Tulagi, a small island across the channel from Guadalcanal. Japanese forces had briefly occupied Tulagi in May, establishing a seaplane base before withdrawing under American air attack. Now the Americans were fortifying their positions there, building facilities, positioning anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese pilot who had flown over Tulagi during the brief occupation described the strategic value in his after-action report. The harbor offered protected anchorage for destroyers and cruisers. The hills provided observation points covering the approaches. Most critically, aircraft based on Guadalcanal would be within easy range of Tulagi, creating interlocking defensive positions that would be costly to assault. Yamamoto read the report and understood that the Americans were thinking several moves ahead. They were not simply building an airfield, they were creating a fortress. The contrast between Japanese confidence and American industrial capacity created a cognitive dissonance that permeated every planning session. Officers who had witnessed the fall of Singapore or the destruction of the ABDA fleet in the Java Sea spoke with certainty about Japanese naval superiority. Officers who had studied at American universities or served as naval attachés in Washington warned about underestimating American resolve. The debates grew heated. One faction argued for aggressive expansion while American forces remained weak. Another faction cautioned that overextension would create vulnerabilities the Americans could exploit. Yamamoto listened to both sides and made his decision based on geography rather than ideology. The Solomons could be defended. The Solomons could be supplied. The Solomons could serve as the forward defensive line that would protect Rabaul and the Japanese position in New Guinea. What happened there would determine whether Japan could hold the Southwest Pacific or would be forced into a grinding war of attrition it could not win. The orders went out on June 2nd. Fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku would be available by mid-July after completing repairs and replenishing their air groups. The light carrier Ryujo would provide additional air cover. Heavy cruisers Kinugasa, Chikuma, and Kumano would form the surface strike force. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka would lead the transport operation, using fast destroyers to deliver supplies and reinforcements under cover of darkness. The operation received the designation Operation KA, reflecting its importance to the overall Pacific strategy. For Yamamoto, standing in that smoke-filled conference room with maps covering every wall, the die was now cast. That the Solomon Islands would be where Japan proved it could defend its conquests, or where the empire's expansion reached its high water mark and began receding. He rolled up the reconnaissance photos, handed them to his aide, and walked out onto the deck to watch the sun setting over Rabaul Harbor. The war's next chapter was about to begin, and he alone understood how narrow the margin for error had become. June 18, 1942. Inside a converted Quonset hut at Pearl Harbor's station Haipo, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. Before him lay sheets of encrypted Japanese radio traffic, captured by listening stations scattered across the Pacific, and forwarded to his cryptanalysis team for decoding. The messages appeared as endless strings of 5-digit number groups, as each representing a word or phrase in the Japanese naval code system designated JN-25. For 6 months, Rochefort's team of 140 specialists had been attacking this code with methodical persistence, building frequency tables, testing hypotheses, searching for patterns in what appeared to be random noise. Today they had broken through. The message taking shape beneath his pencil notations was an operational order for a major fleet movement toward the Solomon Islands, scheduled to begin in early July. The smoking gun. The work of breaking JN-25 bore no resemblance to Hollywood's dramatic portrayals of code breaking. There were no sudden eureka moments, no single brilliant insight that unlocked everything. Instead, the process resembled archaeological excavation, careful, tedious, audit requiring patience and attention to patterns that emerged only after analyzing thousands of messages. The Japanese naval code used a book containing roughly 45,000 5-digit groups, each representing a word, phrase, or tactical instruction. These groups were then further encrypted by adding another set of 5-digit numbers called the additive, making direct translation impossible without knowing both the codebook and the additive tables. Rochefort's team had reconstructed approximately 30 to 40% of the codebook by June, enough to read the general meaning of messages, but not every specific detail. The intercept from June 20th filled in crucial gaps. The message revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was planning a major operation designated KA, involving multiple carrier task forces, as to transport ships carrying troops and construction equipment, and a schedule that suggested D-Day would fall in early August. The destination remained partially obscured by code groups Station Hypo had not yet solved, but contextual clues pointed to the Solomon Islands. References to RR appeared frequently throughout the message, a designator Rochefort's team had previously identified as referring to Rabaul. References to AF also appeared, which the Americans had earlier determined meant Midway, but a new designator kept appearing, RXZ. The cryptanalysts cross-referenced this with previous intercepts, direction-finding bearings from radio transmissions, and reconnaissance reports. RXZ was Guadalcanal. The Japanese were planning to seize and fortify Guadalcanal. It is turning it into a major air and naval base that would threaten the sea lanes to Australia. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the intelligence summary on June 26th in his office overlooking Pearl Harbor. The report was stamped ultra-secret, classification reserved for intelligence derived from enemy communications. Nimitz read it twice, then called his intelligence officer to verify the source reliability. How confident was Station Hypo in this assessment? Rochefort's evaluation was characteristically precise. 80% confidence in the general operational plan, 60% confidence in the specific timing, 40% confidence in force composition details. Many code groups remained unsolved. Many Japanese transmissions were too garbled by atmospheric interference to intercept clearly. The intelligence was good enough to act upon, but not good enough to guarantee success. Nimitz faced the same decision military commanders have confronted throughout history: whether to commit forces based on incomplete information or wait for clarity that might arrive too late. The strategic situation demanded immediate response. If Japan fortified Guadalcanal, the entire South Pacific strategy would collapse. Australian forces were already engaged in New Guinea, fighting desperately to prevent Japanese troops from crossing the Owen Stanley Range and capturing Port Moresby. Supply convoys from the United States to Australia passed within aircraft range of the Solomon Islands. Once Japanese bombers and fighters operated from Guadalcanal, those convoys would require heavy naval escorts or risk destruction, and the sea lanes would become contested territory, forcing a massive diversion of American naval resources simply to maintain communications with Australia. Nimitz studied the maps and made his decision. The Americans would strike first. They would seize Guadalcanal before the Japanese could fortify it, turning the enemy's own strategic logic against them. Operation Watchtower would commence on August 7, 1942. But knowing the enemy's plan and executing a successful counterplan were entirely different challenges. The American Pacific Fleet had been rebuilding since Pearl Harbor, but the margin of superiority remained razor thin. The carrier Yorktown had been sunk at Midway in early June. The carrier Lexington had been lost at Coral Sea in May. That left exactly 4 operational American fleet carriers in the entire Pacific: Saratoga, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. The Japanese had 5 operational fleet carriers, plus several light carriers. American battleships still outnumbered Japanese battleships, but battleships were nearly irrelevant in carrier warfare. The battles would be decided by aircraft launched from carriers beyond visual range of each other, by pilots who could locate enemy ships, penetrate air defenses, and deliver bombs or torpedoes with precision. The intelligence advantage from Station Hypo gave the Americans knowledge, but knowledge alone would not sink ships. Rochefort's team continued monitoring Japanese communications as Operation Watchtower's planning intensified. New intercepts revealed that the Japanese were aware of increased American activity in the South Pacific, but apparently did not know the Americans had targeted Guadalcanal specifically. Japanese radio traffic discussed reinforcing Rabaul, positioning submarines along probable American approach routes, and establishing air patrol patterns. But there was no indication they suspected the Americans were planning an amphibious assault. This gap in Japanese intelligence was partly operational security on the American side, partly Japanese overconfidence, and partly the natural fog of war that obscured both sides' understanding. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming. The Japanese knew the Americans were active in the region. Neither side had complete visibility into the other's intentions or capabilities. The signals intelligence also revealed something more troubling: Japanese confidence in their code security. Intercepted messages included references to secure communications and confidential channels, suggesting Japanese commanders believed their transmissions could not be read by the enemy. This complacency was the Americans' greatest asset. As long as the Japanese continued using JN-25 without suspecting it had been compromised, Station Hypo could provide strategic warning of major operations. But this advantage was fragile. A single mistake, a captured codebook, a prisoner interrogation that revealed too much, or a successful operation that seemed to anticipate Japanese movements too perfectly. Any of these could alert Tokyo that their communications had been penetrated. The Rochefort stressed to Nimitz that the intelligence advantage must be protected at all costs, even if that meant accepting tactical disadvantages in individual engagements. The cryptanalysts worked in shifts around the clock, processing intercepts as they arrived from listening stations in Hawaii, Alaska, Australia, and scattered islands across the Pacific. The work was mentally exhausting, staring at columns of numbers, testing hypotheses about code group meanings, cross-referencing thousands of previous messages, checking and rechecking conclusions before submitting them as intelligence reports. The pressure was immense. Mistakes could cost lives. Missed clues could mean surprise attacks. Overconfidence in partially decoded messages could lead commanders to make disastrous decisions based on faulty intelligence. Rochefort's team operated with the understanding that they were fighting a parallel war, a battle of information and deception, where victories were measured in percentage points of code reconstruction and the reliability of traffic analysis. By early July, the intelligence picture had crystallized sufficiently for operational planning. Japanese fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku would provide air cover for the Guadalcanal operation. The light carrier Ryujo would support transport convoys. Heavy cruisers and destroyers would form screening forces and provide fire support. Transport ships would carry approximately 2,000 troops and construction equipment. The operation would likely commence in early to mid-August, depending on final preparations at Rabaul. This intelligence allowed American commanders to position their forces with confidence that they would intercept the Japanese fleet near Guadalcanal, but it also revealed the scale of the challenge. The Americans would be fighting with roughly equal carrier forces, but significantly less experienced pilots and untested combat coordination. The battle would be decided by factors intelligence could not predict: luck, weather, individual pilot skill, split-second decisions by commanders reacting to rapidly changing circumstances. Rochefort walked out of Station Hypo into the bright Hawaiian sunshine on July 1st and permitted himself a moment of reflection. His team had done everything possible with the intelligence available. They had identified the threat, located the objective, estimated the enemy force composition, and provided timely warning that allowed American commanders to prepare a response. The rest was beyond his control. In the coming weeks, young men would climb into aircraft, launch from carrier decks, search vast expanses of ocean for enemy ships, and fight battles where success meant survival and failure meant death. The signals intelligence that made those battles possible would remain secret for decades. The cryptanalysts who broke the codes would receive no public recognition, no medals pinned in front of news cameras, no victory parades. They were ghosts in the machine, invisible warriors whose contributions would only be understood by future historians with access to classified documents. Rochefort went back inside and returned to work. The war continued and the intercepts kept arriving. July 2nd, 1942. The USS Enterprise sat in dry dock at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, swarming with workers who attacked the carrier's battle damage with frantic urgency. The ship had limped into harbor 3 days earlier after fighting at Midway, where 3 direct hits and 71 near misses had torn holes in the flight deck, damaged fuel lines, destroyed gun mounts, and killed dozens of crewmen. The repair schedule called for 340 specific fixes to be completed in 48 hours. Welders worked in shifts around the clock. Electricians rewired damaged systems. Carpenters replaced shattered flight deck planking. The entire shipyard operated with the understanding that Enterprise needed to be combat-ready by July 7th. Because intelligence indicated a major Japanese operation in the Solomons was imminent, and America had exactly 3 operational fleet carriers to respond. The timeline was not negotiable. Admiral Chester Nimitz had received Station Hypo's intelligence estimate on June 26th and immediately begun positioning American forces for a counter-operation. The carrier Saratoga was already at sea, having departed Pearl Harbor on June 1st for patrols in the South Pacific. The carrier Wasp was operating near the New Hebrides, providing air cover for supply convoys. Enterprise and Hornet were the fleet's mobile reserve, the strike force that could respond to unexpected Japanese movements. But Hornet required routine maintenance that would take weeks. That left Enterprise as the only available carrier that could reinforce Saratoga and Wasp in time to contest Japan's Guadalcanal operation. The ship had to be ready. The alternative was allowing Japan to seize Guadalcanal unopposed, establishing an airbase that would dominate the South Pacific for years. The carrier's air group was as damaged as the ship itself. Squadron losses at Midway had been severe. Fighting Squadron 6 had lost 3 fighters in combat. Scouting Squadron 6 had lost 5 dive bombers. Torpedo Squadron 6 had been nearly wiped out, with only 4 aircraft returning from the battle. Replacement aircraft were already being loaded aboard, but replacement pilots were harder to find. The Navy's training pipeline could produce basic pilots in 6 months, but combat-ready pilots required 10 to 12 months of specialized carrier training, learning to land on a moving deck, mastering dive bombing techniques, coordinating with other aircraft in formation, flying. These skills could not be rushed without risking accidents and deaths. The pilots boarding Enterprise in early July averaged 24 years old, with 245 flight hours of training. They would be facing Japanese pilots who averaged 600 flight hours or more, who had combat experience dating back to the Chinese campaign, who knew their aircraft and tactics with the confidence born from years of practice. The mechanics of carrier operations imposed their own constraints. Each Dauntless dive bomber carried a maximum bomb load of 1,000 pounds, typically a single 1,000-pound bomb for attacking ships or multiple smaller bombs for ground targets. The aircraft had a combat radius of roughly 250 nautical miles, meaning they could attack targets up to that distance and still have enough fuel to return to the carrier. Torpedo bombers had even shorter range, approximately 200 nautical miles, and required a much longer attack approach that left them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Each attack required precise coordination between different squadron types. Fighters would sweep ahead to engage enemy combat air patrol. Dive bombers would approach from high altitude and attack in steep dives to maximize accuracy. And torpedo bombers would attack at wave-top height from multiple directions, forcing enemy ships to choose which threat to defend against. Success required all three squadron types to arrive simultaneously, overwhelming enemy defenses through coordinated assault. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Enterprise's Air Group Commander, assembled his squadron leaders for a briefing on July 5th. He laid out the tactical challenges with brutal honesty. American pilots were less experienced than their Japanese counterparts. American aircraft had some advantages. The F-4F Wildcat fighter was rugged and could absorb damage that would destroy a Japanese Zero. But the Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with superior training. American dive bombers were accurate and well-armored. Japanese dive bombers carried heavier bomb loads. The Americans had one critical advantage: radar. Enterprise's CXAM radar could detect large ships at 80 nautical miles and aircraft formations at similar ranges. The Japanese had no equivalent technology. This meant American carriers could detect incoming attacks earlier and position defensive fighters more effectively. The question was whether radar-guided defense could offset the Japanese advantage in pilot skill and combat experience. The repair crews completed their work on July 7th, 12 hours ahead of the critical deadline. Enterprise's commanding officer, Captain Arthur C. Davis, conducted a shakedown cruise to test all systems before committing the ship to combat operations. The carrier steamed in circles off Oahu while damage control teams verified every repair, tested every repaired system, checked every connection. The flight deck's damage section had been reinforced with steel plating that added weight but restored structural integrity. Fuel lines had been rerouted to bypass damaged sections. Anti-aircraft guns had been remounted with improved firing arcs. By nightfall on July 7th, Davis pronounced the ship combat-ready. Enterprise turned south and accelerated to maximum speed, racing to join Saratoga and Wasp near the Solomon Islands. The carrier would reach the operational area by July 23rd if weather held and no mechanical failures occurred. That gave the fleet approximately 2 weeks to prepare for the expected Japanese offensive. The strategic situation created enormous pressure on American commanders. They knew the Japanese were coming. They knew when and where. But they were responding with a fleet that was barely adequate to the task, with pilots who were undertrained, with ships that had been rushed through repairs, with tactical doctrines that were still being developed through trial and error. The margin for mistakes was non-existent. A single tactical error, a missed reconnaissance report, a failure in communication between ships could lead to carriers being sunk and the entire South Pacific strategy collapsing. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force, understood these stakes perfectly. He had commanded carrier forces at Coral Sea and Midway, had seen how quickly battles could turn on chance events, had experienced both victory and loss in the span of hours. His orders for the upcoming operation reflected hard-won lessons. Maintain dispersed formations to prevent multiple carriers being caught by a single attack. Keep fighters on combat air patrol at all times. Launch searches at dawn and dusk when visibility changes made surprise attacks most likely. The American fleet composition for the battle reflected every available resource being committed. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, would form the core striking force. Each carrier would be screened by cruisers and destroyers, providing anti-aircraft defense and anti-submarine protection. The battleship North Carolina would accompany the force, not because battleships were useful in carrier warfare, but because the ship was too valuable to risk leaving undefended at a forward base. Supply ships would maintain positions several hundred miles behind the carrier force, ready to replenish fuel and ammunition, but safely distant from combat. The entire task force would need to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles of ocean, maintain radio silence to avoid revealing their position, and somehow intercept a Japanese fleet that also knew the value of secrecy and surprise. Aboard Enterprise, pilots conducted final training exercises as the carrier steamed south. They practiced intercept procedures, tested radio protocols, rehearsed attack patterns against simulated targets. The training revealed troubling gaps. Many pilots had never fired their weapons at moving targets. Some had never landed on a carrier at night. Almost had never experienced combat and did not fully understand what they would face when Japanese fighters appeared or anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Squadron commanders did what they could to prepare their men psychologically as well as technically. They explained the realities of combat. 40% of pilots in a major engagement could expect to be casualties, meaning killed, wounded, or lost at sea. They emphasized the importance of maintaining formation discipline, staying with their wingmen, following attack protocols even when instincts screamed to break formation and flee. They reminded pilots that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The final briefing occurred on July 22nd, as Enterprise rendezvoused with Saratoga and Wasp near the Santa Cruz Islands, approximately 300 miles east of Guadalcanal. Admiral Fletcher addressed his commanders via radio, knowing that every ship in the task force would be listening. His message was characteristically direct. The Japanese were coming to seize Guadalcanal. The American fleet's mission was to prevent that from happening. Success would require every ship, every aircraft, every sailor and pilot functioning at maximum capability. There would be no reserves, no second chances, no opportunity for do-overs if the first attack failed. He concluded with a quote that would be remembered by those who heard it. "Gentlemen, we are going into harm's way. Act accordingly." The radio clicked off. The task force turned west toward Guadalcanal. The race against time was ending. The battle was about to begin. July 26, 1942. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the flag bridge of USS Saratoga, studying reconnaissance photographs spread across the navigation table. The images showed Japanese positions on Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi, captured by long-range patrol aircraft that morning. Fletcher had commanded American carrier forces through 3 major battles in 4 months: the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea in May, and Midway in June. Each battle had taught him that victory or defeat often hinged on decisions made by individual commanders in the field, not by admirals in headquarters. Now he faced another set of impossible choices. Should he position Saratoga as bait to draw out the Japanese fleet, risking the carrier in order to locate and destroy enemy carriers? Or should he maintain defensive positioning, preserving his ships but potentially allowing the Japanese to strike first? Every decision created vulnerabilities. Every choice opened opportunities for the enemy. 400 miles to the north, Admiral Nobitake Kondo stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chokai, reviewing his own intelligence reports and reaching troubling conclusions. American radio traffic had increased significantly over the past week. American patrol aircraft had been spotted throughout the Solomon Islands region. Most concerning, several Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had failed to return from missions over suspected American carrier positions, suggesting the Americans had strengthened their combat air patrols. Kondo had commanded Japanese naval forces through China and the early Pacific campaigns, and he understood American capabilities better than most of his colleagues. If the Americans were concentrating carriers near Guadalcanal, they either intended to defend the island against Japanese attack or were planning their own offensive operation. Either possibility suggested that Japanese operational security had been compromised. The Americans knew too much, responded too quickly, appeared too ready for battle. Kondo's orders from Admiral Yamamoto were explicit and unforgiving. Destroy American carriers at any cost. The Imperial Navy had built its strategy around decisive battle, the single overwhelming engagement that would shatter enemy morale and force a negotiated peace. 4 years of war in China had taught Japanese commanders to value the offensive, to seek out enemy forces and destroy them before they could consolidate. The Solomons campaign was intended to be another step in this strategy: seize Guadalcanal, establish air dominance, force the Americans to fight under disadvantageous conditions. But intelligence reports suggested the Americans had upset this timetable. They were already present in force. They appeared to be waiting. Kondo made a note in his personal log that night. "Enemy has demonstrated troubling ability to anticipate our movements. Recommend review of communication security protocols." The note would be ignored by higher command. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka commanded the transport force designated to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal. His reputation had been built on the Tokyo Express, the nickname American forces gave to his high-speed nighttime supply runs, using destroyers and fast cruisers rather than slow cargo ships. Tanaka understood logistics in ways that many combat-focused admirals did not. Supplying Guadalcanal required approximately 1,000 tons of food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment per week to maintain Japanese forces there. Each destroyer could carry roughly 50 tons of supplies. Therefore, maintaining the garrison required 20 destroyer runs per week, or 3 runs per night every night, assuming no ships were lost to enemy action. This was unsustainable. The destroyers were needed for fleet screening and anti-submarine patrol. Using them as cargo ships degraded the fleet's combat capability while failing to deliver sufficient supplies for sustained operations. Tanaka had argued for using slower but larger transport ships, accepting higher risk of air attack in exchange for greater cargo capacity. His superiors had rejected this recommendation, insisting that speed and secrecy were more important than tonnage. The American carrier force represented 3 distinct commands with different combat histories and tactical philosophies. Enterprise had fought at Midway, where aggressive action had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, but also exposed American ships to counterattacks. Saratoga had fought at Coral Sea, where caution had preserved the carrier, but allowed damaged Japanese carriers to escape. Wasp was the newest addition to the Pacific Fleet. Ulm transferred from the Atlantic in June, with a crew that lacked combat experience but possessed enthusiasm and confidence. Coordinating these 3 commands required precise communication protocols and mutual understanding of tactical doctrine. Admiral Fletcher had established radio call signs and communication frequencies for each carrier, designated primary and secondary attack axes, specified formation patterns for different combat scenarios. On paper, the coordination looked seamless. In practice, radio failures, atmospheric interference, and human error could instantly reduce careful planning to chaos. Squadron commanders represented another layer of individual decision-making that would prove critical. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin led Scouting Squadron 6 aboard Enterprise, the dive bomber unit that would conduct the initial search and attack missions. Lieutenant Turner Caldwell commanded Enterprise's Fighting Squadron 6, responsible for combat air patrol and escort duties. Lieutenant Harold Larson led Torpedo Squadron 6, replacing the previous commander who had been killed at Midway. Each squadron had its own culture, traditions, and tactical preferences shaped by training and combat experience. Dive bomber pilots prided themselves on accuracy, measuring success by percentage of bombs that hit their targets. Fighter pilots emphasized aggressiveness and dogfighting skill, keeping score of aerial victories. Torpedo bomber pilots, flying the slowest and most vulnerable aircraft, developed a fatalistic camaraderie born from suffering the highest casualty rates in carrier aviation. The 8 Japanese carrier air groups reflected similar individual variations within a broader tactical framework. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku had participated in Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and Coral Sea, building air groups with extensive combat experience and refined attack coordination. Their pilots had practiced together for years, knew each other's capabilities intimately, had developed instinctive responses to complex tactical situations. The light carrier Ryujo had a smaller air group with less combat experience but greater familiarity with operating independently, conducting searches and anti-submarine patrols rather than participating in major fleet actions. These different backgrounds would influence how each carrier's aircraft responded when battles developed in unexpected directions. And Fletcher faced a decision point on the afternoon of July 26th that revealed the burdens of command. Reconnaissance aircraft had reported possible Japanese carrier positions approximately 250 miles north of Guadalcanal. The report was vague, the coordinates uncertain, the number of carriers unclear. Fletcher could launch an immediate strike with every available aircraft, potentially catching the Japanese carriers unprepared, but also leaving his own carriers without defensive aircraft if the reconnaissance report proved false or if other Japanese carriers remained unlocated. Alternatively, he could wait for additional reconnaissance to confirm the enemy position, accepting the risk that delay might allow the Japanese to attack first. No intelligence report could tell him which choice was correct, and no staff officer could guarantee the success of either option. The decision was his alone, to be made in minutes with consequences that would reverberate for months. He chose to launch a limited strike, enough aircraft to inflict damage if the target was real, but not so many that his carriers would be defenseless. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and 15 from Saratoga would attack the reported position. Fighters would maintain combat air patrol over the American fleet. Torpedo bombers would remain on deck, armed and ready to launch if enemy carriers approached American positions. This represented a compromise between offense and defense, between seizing opportunity and maintaining security. Whether it was the right decision would only become clear in hindsight, after the attacks had been launched, e.g. the targets located or missed, the casualties counted, and the results assessed. Fletcher turned to his communications officer and gave the order to launch. The air operations officer's whistle sounded across Saratoga's flight deck. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Engines roared to life. The battle was beginning, though no one aboard the American carriers yet understood what form it would take. Aboard Chokai, Admiral Kondo was making his own irreversible choices. His reconnaissance aircraft had reported American carriers southeast of Guadalcanal. The range was extreme, approximately 300 nautical miles. Japanese aircraft would be operating at the edge of their combat radius, with minimal fuel for combat or evasion once they reached the target area. But waiting would allow the Americans to strike first. And Japanese naval doctrine emphasized the importance of attacking decisively rather than defending passively. Kondo ordered both Shokaku and Zuikaku to prepare for launch. 69 aircraft would form the strike force, 21 Zero fighters, 36 Val dive bombers, 12 Kate torpedo bombers. The largest coordinated strike the Japanese carrier force could assemble. If the American carriers were where reconnaissance reported, this strike would cripple or destroy them. If the reconnaissance was wrong, the strike force would return to find Japanese carriers vulnerable and undermanned. The decision, like Fletcher's decision 400 miles away, could only be evaluated by its outcome. Kondo gave the order. Flight deck crews began positioning aircraft for launch. The battle's opening phase was taking shape. July 24th, 1942, 6:45 in the morning. Ensign Richard Gray lifted his Dauntless dive bomber off Enterprise's flight deck and climbed into the dawn sky, beginning a search pattern that would take him 200 miles northwest of the carrier task force. His mission was reconnaissance: find Japanese ships, report their position, avoid combat. The cockpit smelled of oil and salt water. The radio crackled with atmospheric interference. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched empty in every direction, a vast blue desert where enemy fleets could hide for days without being spotted. Gray followed his assigned search corridor, sweeping his gaze back and forth across the horizon, searching for smoke plumes, wakes, anything that might indicate ships below. For 3 hours, he saw nothing but water and clouds. At 9:30, as Gray's radio operator tapped his shoulder and pointed northwest, a dark smudge on the horizon, barely visible through morning haze. Gray altered course to investigate, climbing to 10,000 feet to improve visibility, while maintaining enough distance to avoid alerting enemy ships. As he approached, the smudge resolved into ships, multiple vessels moving in formation. He counted quickly: 2 carriers, possibly 3, multiple cruisers and destroyers. This was not a transport convoy. This was a major fleet formation. Exactly what American intelligence had predicted would appear near the Solomons in late July. Gray grabbed his radio microphone and transmitted the sighting report in clear language, knowing that Japanese ships would intercept the message, but understanding that speed was more critical than security. 2 or more carriers, as bearing 320 degrees from Point Z, distance 160 miles. The transmission would take 12 minutes to reach Enterprise's Combat Information Center, where plotting officers would triangulate the position and relay it to Admiral Fletcher. Enterprise's CIC erupted in controlled chaos when the sighting report arrived. Plotting officers marked the position on their navigation charts. Communications officers relayed the report to Saratoga and WASP. Intelligence officers compared the reported position with predictions based on Japanese radio intercepts from Station Hypo. Admiral Fletcher appeared in the CIC 3 minutes after the report arrived and immediately began assessing options. The reported Japanese position was approximately 180 nautical miles northwest of the American fleet. as this was beyond the combat radius of torpedo bombers, but within range for dive bombers operating with minimal fuel reserves. Fighter escort was possible, but would leave minimal time over the target area before fuel required breaking off and returning to the carriers. The alternative was waiting for the Japanese to close the distance, but that risked allowing them to strike first. At 2:25 that afternoon, a second reconnaissance aircraft transmitted a clarification. The Japanese force included one large carrier and one smaller carrier, not two fleet carriers as first reported. This distinction was critical. A large carrier, Shokaku or Zuikaku, carried 75 to 80 aircraft and represented a major threat. A smaller carrier, likely Ryujo, carried only 20 to 30 aircraft and was less dangerous. Thus, but the report remained unclear about whether the large carrier was the only fleet carrier present or whether other Japanese carriers remained undetected elsewhere. Fletcher faced the fundamental problem of naval warfare: incomplete information that nonetheless required immediate decisions. Every minute of delay allowed the Japanese to maneuver, to close range, potentially to attack first. Every minute of haste risked launching attacks against targets that might be decoys, while the real Japanese fleet approached from a different direction. At 3 o'clock, Enterprise's CXAM radar detected large blips approximately 80 nautical miles to the northwest. The radar signature suggested multiple large ships, possibly carriers, possibly battleships, moving southeast toward the American fleet. Just this electronic confirmation transformed the reconnaissance reports from probable to certain. The Japanese were there. They were moving toward combat range. They were preparing for battle. Fletcher made his decision at 3:15. All available dive bombers would launch immediately, targeting the reported Japanese carrier position. Fighters would maintain combat air patrol over the American carriers. Torpedo bombers would remain on deck, armed and ready to launch if the radar contacts continued approaching. This was the maximum offensive effort Fletcher could launch while maintaining adequate defense. Whether it would be sufficient depended on factors beyond his control: pilot skill, weather over the target, Japanese defensive reactions. And the fundamental uncertainty about whether he was attacking the main Japanese fleet or a detachment while the primary force approached from elsewhere. The launch sequence began at 3:30. 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise's scouting squadron. 6 roared down the flight deck and climbed toward the northwest. 15 additional dive bombers from Saratoga followed 10 minutes later. 7 Wildcat fighters provided escort, their role being to suppress enemy combat air patrol rather than to engage in extended dogfighting. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin led the Enterprise strike force, navigating by dead reckoning toward the last reported enemy position. The aircraft flew in, stepped formation, armed with different squadrons stacked at 1,000-foot intervals to avoid collisions and facilitate coordinated attack once the target was located. Radio discipline required silence during the approach flight, meaning each pilot flew alone with his thoughts, knowing that the next hours would test everything he had trained for and possibly end his life. The strike force reached the estimated target position at 4:30 and found empty ocean. Crommelin ordered the aircraft to begin a square search pattern, expanding their search area to account for errors in the original position report. At 4:45, a lookout spotted wakes to the northeast. Crommelin led his formation toward the sighting and soon identified a carrier with escorts, but it was not Shokaku or Zuikaku. The carrier was smaller, older, moving independently of major fleet formations. This was Ryujo, the light carrier Japanese forces were using to provide air cover for transport operations to Guadalcanal. Crommelin faced an immediate tactical dilemma. His orders were to attack Japanese carriers. Ryujo was a carrier, but obviously not the primary target Station Hypo's intelligence had predicted. Attacking Ryujo would consume his strike force's ordnance and leave the American fleet vulnerable if larger Japanese carriers remained at large. But failing to attack meant returning to Enterprise with bombs still loaded, having accomplished nothing except confirming that Japanese ships were in the area. Crommelin decided to attack. His reasoning was pragmatic rather than strategic. A carrier was a carrier. Ryujo might be smaller than Shokaku, but it still carried aircraft that could attack American ships. Destroying it would reduce the Japanese air threat, even if it was not the primary objective. He signaled the attack order at 4:50, and his dive bombers began their approach runs. The attack unfolded with the precision of peacetime exercises. Cromwell's aircraft dove from 14,000 feet at 70-degree angles, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at 2,500 feet and pulling out at dangerous altitudes to avoid flying through their own bomb blasts. The bombs hit Ryujo with devastating accuracy. 2 direct hits amidships, multiple near misses along the waterline. Fires erupted across the small carrier's flight deck. Japanese damage control teams fought desperately to contain the spreading flames. But the ship's small size meant a single bomb could cause catastrophic damage to multiple critical systems. As the American bombers climbed away from their target, they could see Ryujo listing heavily to port, smoke pouring from ruptured fuel tanks. The carrier was clearly doomed. But even as Cromwell led his formation back toward Enterprise, doubts gnawed at him. Had he just destroyed an important target, or had he allowed himself to be distracted by a secondary objective while the main Japanese carriers remained unlocated and dangerous? The question would haunt him for days afterward, but in the moment, all he could do was maintain formation discipline, navigate back to Enterprise, and hope that enough fuel remained for every pilot to reach the carrier safely. 3 aircraft ran out of fuel during the return flight and ditched in the ocean, their crews rescued hours later by American destroyers. The rest landed aboard Enterprise just before sunset, exhausted pilots climbing out of cockpits to face immediate debriefing about what they had seen and accomplished. The after-action report confirmed Ryujo had been hit and was probably sinking, but reconnaissance aircraft had spotted additional Japanese carriers approximately 60 miles northwest of Ryujo's position. The fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, untouched and fully operational. Fletcher received this information at 6:30 that evening and understood immediately what had happened. The Americans had sunk a light carrier while the main Japanese fleet remained intact and dangerous. Worse, by launching his strike against Ryujo, he had revealed his own carrier positions to Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that had undoubtedly been tracking the American bombers during their return flight. The opening phase of the battle had been a tactical victory, 1 Japanese carrier destroyed, but a strategic setback. The main Japanese carriers now knew where to find the American fleet, and Fletcher's strike aircraft were recovering aboard Enterprise and Saratoga rather than preparing for immediate relaunch. The next attack would come from the Japanese, and it would hit American carriers that had just completed complex flight operations and were at their most vulnerable. The first contact had revealed the battle's fundamental pattern. Incomplete information leading to imperfect decisions, leading to outcomes that raised more questions than they answered. July 24th, 1942, 2:30 in the afternoon. Commander Tadashi Nakajima stood on Ryujo's bridge and watched American dive bombers circling at high altitude, preparing for their attack runs. The light carrier had been conducting routine air operations, launching fighters to intercept American patrol aircraft when lookouts spotted the incoming American formation. Nakajima had commanded Ryujo for 8 months, had participated in operations from the Indian Ocean to the South Pacific, understood his ship's vulnerabilities with painful clarity. At 10,000 tons displacement, Ryujo was half the size of fleet carriers like Shokaku. The smaller hull meant less armor protection, fewer compartments that could be sealed off during damage control, less redundancy in critical systems. A bomb that would merely damage a fleet carrier could prove catastrophic to Ryujo. He ordered all available fighters launched immediately, then began evasive maneuvers, throwing the carrier into hard turns that made flight operations nearly impossible, but might cause American bomb runs to miss. Lieutenant Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bomber formation down from 14,000 feet, his Dauntless screaming through thin air at terminal velocity. The target below executed violent turns, swinging the carrier's bow through wide arcs that complicated aiming calculations. McCluskey compensated by extending his dive, waiting until the last possible moment to release his 1,000-pound bomb. The aircraft shuddered as the bombs separated, and McCluskey hauled back on the control stick with both hands. At pulling out of the dive so close to the water that salt spray covered his windscreen, Behind him, the bomb struck Ryujo's flight deck slightly forward of amidships, penetrating through wooden planking into the hangar deck below. The explosion ignited aviation fuel from aircraft that had been preparing for launch. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The bombing attack lasted 15 minutes, but felt eternal to Ryujo's crew. American dive bombers appeared from multiple directions, forcing the carrier to maintain constant evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft gunners fired continuously, their 25mm weapons creating a curtain of steel that was impressive but largely ineffective against aircraft diving at 400 miles per hour. A second bomb hit the carrier aft, and destroying the steering mechanism and leaving Ryujo unable to maneuver. A third bomb struck near the island's superstructure, killing the damage control officer and most of his team. Fire spread through internal compartments as smoke filled passageways and made rescue operations nearly impossible. By 2:45, Nakajima understood his ship could not be saved. The fires were beyond control. Flooding was spreading to critical compartments. The list had increased to 15 degrees and was worsening. He gave the order to abandon ship. 600 officers and men began evacuating Ryujo, even as American bombers continued their attack runs. Some sailors jumped directly into the ocean from the tilting flight deck. Others climbed down ropes or slid down the carrier's hull. The Japanese escort destroyers maneuvered close to the sinking carrier despite the danger of underwater explosions, throwing life preservers and lowering boats to retrieve survivors. The ocean temperature was warm enough that hypothermia was not an immediate concern, but sharks were. Several sailors were lost to shark attacks as they awaited rescue. Others drowned when they were pulled under by the suction from Ryujo's sinking. The carrier capsized at 3:55, rolling completely over to reveal its red-painted bottom before sliding beneath the waves. Of Ryujo's complement, approximately 450 were rescued. 150 went down with the ship or were killed during the bombing attack. The tactical irony of Ryujo's destruction would only become apparent hours later when reconnaissance aircraft reported that Shokaku and Zuikaku remained operational and apparently undamaged. American commanders had committed their available strike aircraft to destroying a secondary target, while the primary Japanese carriers escaped detection and attack. This misidentification was partly the result of incomplete reconnaissance reports, partly the fog of war that made distinguishing between different carrier classes nearly impossible from long range, and partly the natural tendency of pilots under stress to focus on immediate threats rather than searching for potentially more dangerous targets elsewhere. Lieutenant Commander Crommelin, who had led the attack, would defend his decision by noting that Ryujo had been positively identified as an enemy carrier, and that destroying it was a legitimate tactical objective. Critics would counter that sinking a light carrier while fleet carriers remained at large represented a fundamental strategic error. Japanese pilot losses during the Ryujo engagement exceeded the ship's value as a military asset. 21 aircraft had been aboard or near the carrier when the American attack began. Of these, 5 were destroyed on the flight deck by bomb hits. 7 were shot down by American fighters during the engagement. 6 crashed into the ocean after running out of fuel while searching for the sinking carrier. 3 managed to reach other Japanese ships and were recovered. This 100% casualty rate for Ryujo's air group reflected the brutal mathematics of carrier warfare. Once a carrier was sunk or damaged, its aircraft had nowhere to land except on other carriers that might be hundreds of miles away or might not exist. Pilots who survived combat often died from fuel exhaustion, forced to ditch in the ocean and await rescue that might never arrive. American pilot casualties in the Ryujo attack were lighter but still significant. 3 dauntless dive bombers were shot down by anti-aircraft fire during their attack runs. 1 fighter was lost to a Japanese Zero that had evaded the American escort. 6 pilots and aircrew members died. Their bodies were never recovered, claimed by the Pacific Ocean that had already swallowed thousands of sailors and airmen in less than 8 months of war. The survivors returned to Enterprise with mixed feelings. They had successfully attacked an enemy carrier, accomplished their mission, proven they could fight effectively against Japanese forces. But the exhaustion of combat, the loss of squadron mates, and the uncertainty about whether they had attacked the right target created a psychological burden that would manifest in various ways over the following days and weeks. Admiral Fletcher received the initial after-action reports at 4:30 and immediately ordered additional reconnaissance flights to locate the main Japanese carrier force. The fact that Shokaku and Zuikaku remained undetected troubled him deeply. Station Hypo's intelligence had predicted that Japanese fleet carriers would be operating near Guadalcanal. Ryujo had been found and destroyed, but fleet carriers represented a far greater threat. Each could carry 75 to 80 aircraft, compared to Ryujo's 21. Each had better armor protection, superior damage control capabilities, more experienced air groups. Destroying Ryujo was like swatting a mosquito while ignoring the wasp nest. The real battle remained ahead, and Fletcher's strike aircraft were now recovering aboard Enterprise and Saratoga, rather than searching for the primary targets. The Japanese interpretation of the battle's opening phase revealed the information gaps affecting both sides. Admiral Kondo received reports that an American attack had sunk Ryujo, but that the attack had been poorly coordinated and relatively small in scale. This suggested to him that American carrier forces were either smaller than anticipated or were holding back, keeping their main strength in reserve for a later engagement. He ordered Shokaku and Zuikaku to maintain their current position while launching a major strike against reported American carrier positions. The fact that American bombers had attacked Ryujo meant they had come from carriers within approximately 200 miles. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft would locate those carriers, and Japanese bombers would destroy them. The loss of Ryujo was regrettable but acceptable if it allowed the main Japanese force to strike decisively against American fleet carriers. By sunset on July 24th, the battle's scorecard appeared straightforward, but was actually deeply ambiguous. Japan had lost 1 light carrier sunk, 21 aircraft destroyed, approximately 150 sailors killed. America had lost 4 aircraft, its 6 aircrew members killed, and had expended significant ordnance without locating the primary enemy force. Traditional naval arithmetic suggested a modest American victory. 1 enemy ship sunk, relatively light American casualties. But the strategic situation suggested something more complex. The Japanese main carrier force remained intact and dangerous. American carriers had revealed their approximate positions by launching the attack. The next phase of battle would see Japanese carrier aircraft attacking American carriers, and the question of who would emerge victorious remained entirely open. The wrong target had been destroyed, but whether that tactical error would prove decisive could only be determined by what happened next. As darkness fell across the Solomon Islands, both fleets maneuvered for position. Both commanders contemplated their next moves, and both sides understood that the battle's opening phase had resolved nothing except to confirm that major combat operations were inevitable. July 24th, 1942, 1:45 in the afternoon. Flight deck crews aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku began positioning aircraft for launch, a complex ballet of tractors, ordnance carts, and fueling hoses that transformed the carrier's deck from empty steel into a crowded arsenal. 21 Zero fighters were spotted forward, engines warming up, pilots already strapped into cockpits. Behind them came 36 Val dive bombers, each loaded with a single 250-kilogram bomb suspended beneath the fuselage. Aft of the dive bombers waited 12 Kate torpedo bombers, the most dangerous aircraft in the Japanese arsenal, each carrying a Type 91 torpedo with a 1,000-pound warhead. Admiral Kondo had ordered this strike after receiving reconnaissance reports placing American carriers approximately 280 nautical miles southeast of his position. The range was extreme, leaving minimal fuel for combat over the target, but Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive offensive action. The strike force would find the American carriers, destroy them, and return to Shokaku and Zuikaku before fuel exhaustion forced ditching in the ocean. Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki led the strike force, a veteran pilot with 3 years of combat experience dating back to the Chinese campaign. He had participated in Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and Coral Sea. His knowledge of carrier attack doctrine was encyclopedic. He understood how to coordinate fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, so they arrived over the target simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming defensive systems through sheer complexity of threat. The key was timing. Fighters would arrive first, engaging the American combat air patrol and clearing space for the bombers. Dive bombers would approach from high altitude, forcing American ships to maneuver and concentrate their anti-aircraft fire upward. Torpedo bombers would attack at wave height from multiple bearings, exploiting the moments when American ships were distracted by dive bombers overhead. Success required split-second coordination and radio discipline that kept the strike force together, despite flying across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The strike force launched at 2:15, climbing away from Shokaku in a ragged formation that would tighten once all aircraft were airborne. Seki led them southeast at 8,000 feet, conserving fuel by maintaining economical cruise speed. His navigation was purely by dead reckoning. Compass headings adjusted for wind drift, time-distance calculations that assumed the American carriers would maintain their reported position and course. Any significant change in enemy movements would cause the strike force to miss the target entirely, leaving 69 aircraft with insufficient fuel to return to their carriers. This was the calculated risk of long-range strikes. The potential payoff, destroying American carriers, justified the danger. The Imperial Navy had built its entire strategy around decisive battles that would shatter enemy morale and force negotiated settlement. This strike represented that strategy in miniature. USS Enterprise's radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 3:30, with the contacts approximately 120 nautical miles northwest. The radar signature was unmistakable, multiple large formations moving southeast at high speed and altitude. Enterprise's air operations officer sounded general quarters immediately. Fighters on combat air patrol were vectored toward the incoming raid. Additional fighters were launched from the flight deck. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers were struck below into the hangar deck to prevent them from being destroyed on the flight deck by Japanese bombs. Gun crews manned their stations. As damage control teams positioned themselves throughout the ship, ready to respond to fires, flooding, or structural damage. The carrier began evasive maneuvers, increasing speed to maximum and beginning a weaving pattern that would complicate Japanese targeting without taking the ship too far from its defensive destroyer screen. Admiral Fletcher faced the same choice every carrier commander confronts when under attack: whether to launch additional fighters and potentially lose them if the carrier is damaged, or keep them aboard and risk being overwhelmed by the incoming strike. He chose to launch everything available. 8 additional Wildcats roared off Enterprise's deck at 3:40, climbing at maximum rate toward the approaching Japanese formation. Their mission was simple: intercept as many Japanese aircraft as possible before they reached attack positions. Even if the fighters were ultimately forced to ditch due to fuel exhaustion or carrier damage, they would serve their purpose by reducing the number of Japanese bombers reaching their targets. This was the brutal arithmetic of carrier defense. Aircraft were expendable, carriers were not. The American Combat Air Patrol intercepted the Japanese strike force at 3:45, approximately 15 miles northwest of the American carrier task force. The ensuing dogfight scattered across 20 miles of sky and multiple altitude bands. American Wildcats, though slower and less maneuverable than Japanese Zeros, compensate with superior diving speed and armor protection. The standard American tactic was to dive through Japanese formations, fire a burst, then zoom climb back to altitude before Zeros could respond. Japanese pilots tried to force the Americans into turning fights where Zero agility would dominate. The result was chaos: aircraft corkscrewing through the sky, tracer rounds stitching patterns through clouds, parachutes blossoming as pilots bailed from damaged aircraft. The Combat Air Patrol could not stop the strike force, only delay and disrupt it. The Japanese bombers continued toward their targets, despite losing 3 Zeros and 2 Vals to American fighters. USS Saratoga came under attack first at 3:50. Japanese dive bombers emerged from clouds at 12,000 feet and immediately rolled into their attack dives. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, all creating a storm of steel through which the Japanese bombers had to fly. 5-inch guns threw up proximity-fused shells that exploded in black puffs across the sky. 40mm quad mounts tracked individual aircraft, their tracers making visible arcs toward diving bombers. 20mm guns fired continuously, their rapid staccato creating a wall of fire around the ship. Despite this defensive barrage, the dive bombers pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. 3 bombs missed Saratoga by narrow margins, their underwater explosions lifting the carrier's stern and causing violent shaking throughout the ship. 1 bomb struck the flight deck aft, penetrating through wooden planking but failing to explode, a dud that would have caused catastrophic damage if its fuse had functioned properly. The torpedo attack began at 3:55. Japanese Kate bombers approached from 3 different directions simultaneously, forcing Saratoga to choose which threat to prioritize. The carrier's captain ordered a hard turn to port, presenting the ship's narrow profile to 2 of the attacking groups while exposing the starboard side to the 3rd group. 5 Japanese torpedo bombers pressed their attack from starboard, skimming across wave tops at 200 miles per hour. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed 3 of the bombers, but the other 2 released their torpedoes at optimal range. 1 torpedo missed ahead of the carrier's bow. The 2nd torpedo struck amidships on the starboard side, the impact sending a shudder through the entire ship. The explosion was catastrophic. Ninth, the 1,000-pound warhead detonated against Saratoga's hull in machinery, space number 2, rupturing fuel oil tanks, flooding compartments, and destroying the starboard propeller shaft. Power failed throughout the aft section of the ship. Fires erupted in the engineering spaces. Enterprise came under attack simultaneously at 4 o'clock. Japanese dive bombers targeted the carrier from multiple approach angles, using the sun and cloud cover to mask their diving attacks. The carrier's captain ordered extreme evasive maneuvers, throwing Enterprise into hard turns that caused the ship to heel dramatically. Gun crews maintained continuous fire despite the violent maneuvering. 2 Japanese bombs struck near misses, exploding close enough to the hull to cause underwater damage through shock effects. A 3rd bomb grazed the flight deck's edge, gouging a 10-foot section of planking but not penetrating into the hangar deck. A 4th bomb struck the forward elevator, causing significant damage but not disabling the elevator mechanism completely. The carrier remained capable of flight operations despite the damage, but the close calls demonstrated how narrow the margin was between survival and catastrophe. By 4:15, the Japanese strike force was withdrawing, having expended its ordnance and exhausted its combat fuel. American fighters pursued briefly but broke off as the Japanese aircraft fled northward toward their carriers. The battle's 2nd phase had lasted 30 minutes, but felt endless to the sailors who survived it. Damage control teams throughout both American carriers worked frantically to contain fires, seal flooded compartments, restore power, and treat casualties. Aboard Saratoga, the torpedo damage had created a crisis. The starboard propeller shaft was destroyed, limiting the carrier to 20 knots maximum speed. Flooding was spreading despite damage control efforts. 6 sailors had been killed instantly by the torpedo explosion. 16 more were wounded, many with severe burns from the engineering space fires. The ship was not sinking, not yet, but it was crippled. Admiral Fletcher's staff compiled initial damage reports by 4:30 and presented them in the flag plot. Saratoga was heavily damaged and would require withdrawal from the combat zone for repairs. Enterprise was lightly damaged but fully operational. Wasp had not been attacked and remained combat ready. American fighter losses totaled 8 aircraft, with 4 pilots killed and 2 rescued from the ocean. Japanese losses remained uncertain, but appeared to be approximately 10 to 15 aircraft based on fighter pilot claims. Fletcher understood immediately that the tactical situation had shifted dramatically. He now had effectively 2 operational carriers instead of 3. The Japanese had evened the odds. The battle that had begun with American advantages in intelligence and positioning had become a roughly equal contest, where neither side held decisive superiority. The counterattack had achieved exactly what Admiral Kondo intended, reducing American carrier strength and creating conditions for a potentially decisive night surface engagement. July 24, 1942, 4:15 in the afternoon. Chief Engineer Commander Harold Fitch descended into USS Saratoga's machinery spaces carrying damage control reports and struggling against smoke that made breathing painful even through his respirator. The Japanese torpedo had struck in machinery, space number 2, the compartment housing the starboard turbines and associated equipment. Fitch's immediate assessment was grim. The torpedo's 1,000-pound warhead had detonated against the carrier's hull approximately 15 feet below the waterline. The explosion had ruptured the hull across a 20-foot section, allowing seawater to flood into the machinery space. The flooding had caused a progressive casualty cascade. Seawater contacted the hot turbine casings, creating steam that obscured visibility and created scalding hazards. Electrical systems shorted out, causing fires. Fuel oil leaked from ruptured tanks, creating flammable films on the water surface. And 6 sailors had been working in machinery, space number 2, when the torpedo struck. None survived. Fitch established a command post in the undamaged machinery, space number 1, and began coordinating the damage control response. His first priority was containing the flooding. Damage control teams closed watertight doors and hatches, isolating the flooded compartment from adjacent spaces. Pumps were positioned to remove water from compartments where flooding was still manageable. The carrier's design included multiple redundant systems precisely for situations like this. Loss of one machinery space meant reduced speed and power, not complete disability. But the torpedo damage had created complications beyond simple flooding. The starboard propeller shaft had been knocked out of alignment by the explosion's shock wave. Attempting to turn the shaft would cause severe vibration that could propagate through the hull and cause additional structural damage. Fitch ordered the starboard shaft locked and all propulsion transferred to the port shaft. This would limit Saratoga to approximately 20 knots maximum speed, enough to maintain some maneuverability, but not enough to operate aircraft safely in light wind conditions. Admiral Fletcher received Fitch's damage assessment at 4:45 and convened an emergency staff meeting in Saratoga's flag plot. The tactical options were clear and unpleasant. Saratoga could not continue combat operations at reduced speed. The carrier could not adequately evade submarine attacks. It could not maintain position with the faster Enterprise and Wasp. The only reasonable course was withdrawal to a rear area shipyard for repairs. Fletcher estimated repairs would require 5 to 6 months, replacing the propeller shaft, repairing the hull damage, rebuilding the machinery spaces, testing all systems. The Pacific Fleet would be operating with 2 fewer carriers for half a year at a time when every available carrier was critically needed. The alternative was keeping Saratoga in the combat zone and risking its loss to submarine attack or surface action. Fletcher made the decision at 5 o'clock. Saratoga would withdraw immediately, escorted by 2 destroyers, with orders to steam at maximum safe speed toward Pearl Harbor. The carrier's air group would transfer to Enterprise once aircraft fuel levels permitted recovery operations. 400 miles north, and Admiral Kondo was receiving his own damage reports and reaching parallel conclusions about the battle's progression. Japanese carrier aircraft were returning to Shokaku and Zuikaku in 1s and 2s, some damaged, some nearly out of fuel, all exhausted from the long-range strike mission. Pilot debriefings painted a confused picture of the attack results. Some pilots reported seeing 2 American carriers burning and dead in the water. Other pilots reported seeing 1 carrier heavily damaged, but still maneuvering. Still other pilots admitted they had been unable to locate the American carriers at all and had jettisoned their ordnance rather than risk landing aboard their own carriers with armed weapons. Kondo's intelligence officers attempted to reconcile these contradictory reports into a coherent assessment. Their best estimate was that 1 American carrier had been sunk or crippled, 1 carrier was damaged but operational, and possibly 1 additional carrier remained undamaged. This suggested the Americans still possessed significant combat capability. The aircraft recovery operations revealed the cost of the long-range strike. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that had launched at 2:15, 53 returned to their carriers. 16 aircraft were lost, 7 to American fighters, 4 to anti-aircraft fire, 5 to fuel exhaustion or operational accidents. More troubling was the pilot casualty list. 12 pilots killed, 3 wounded badly enough to be removed from flight status. These were experienced aviators, men who had spent years training in carrier operations, who could land on a moving deck in darkness or rough seas. Those who understood their aircraft instinctively and could extract maximum performance from them. Replacing the aircraft would take weeks. Replacing the pilots would take years. Admiral Kondo understood this mathematics perfectly. Each major engagement eroded Japan's pilot strength faster than the training pipeline could replace losses. The Imperial Navy had begun the war with approximately 1,500 carrier-qualified pilots. Coral Sea had cost 77 pilots. Midway had cost 110 pilots. This engagement had cost 12 more. The attrition was unsustainable. As twilight descended across the Solomon Islands, both fleets began night maneuvering, designed to prevent surprise surface attacks. American doctrine called for carrier task forces to maintain tight defensive formations at night, using radar-equipped destroyers as pickets to detect approaching surface ships. Japanese doctrine called for aggressive surface action, using superior night fighting capabilities and long-range Type 93 torpedoes to engage enemy forces in darkness when American air superiority was neutralized. Admiral Fletcher ordered his carriers to steam southeast, increasing distance from the Japanese fleet while maintaining relative position near Guadalcanal. Admiral Kondo considered pursuing for a night surface engagement, but ultimately decided against it. His forces had fought all day. His pilots were exhausted. His intelligence about American positions was uncertain. Committing to a night action risked stumbling into a meeting engagement where superior American radar might provide decisive advantage. The destroyer USS Phelps took position 5,000 yards ahead of the crippled Saratoga as the carrier began its withdrawal toward Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander George Henderson commanded Phelps, a Mahan-class destroyer with a crew of 250 officers and men. His orders were simple: escort Saratoga to safety, screen the carrier against submarine attack, and be prepared to pick up survivors if the torpedo damage proved more severe than damage control teams believed. Henderson understood that his ship was now escorting one of the Pacific Fleet's most valuable assets. Saratoga represented years of construction, millions of dollars of investment, irreplaceable industrial capacity. More importantly, the carrier represented combat capability that could not be quickly replaced. If Saratoga sank en route to Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet would lose not just a ship, but the ability to project air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. Henderson positioned his destroyer carefully, using active sonar to search for submarines while maintaining visual contact with the damaged carrier behind him. Sailors throughout both fleets tried to rest during the night hours, knowing that dawn would likely bring renewed combat. Exhaustion competed with adrenaline. Men who had been at battle stations for 12 hours straight found sleep impossible despite physical fatigue. They replayed the day's events in their minds, remembered friends who had died, worried about what tomorrow would bring. In Enterprise's ready rooms, pilots who had flown combat missions that afternoon attempted to brief squadron mates who would fly tomorrow's missions. The briefings revealed how little they actually knew about the battle's overall situation. They had attacked a carrier. They had seen it burning and listing. But was it sunk? Where were the other Japanese carriers? How many aircraft had the Japanese lost? Would tomorrow bring another major strike, or would both fleets withdraw to lick their wounds? No one had answers. The fog of war obscured everything beyond immediate personal experience. Japanese night reconnaissance aircraft launched from Shokaku at 2:30 in the morning, searching for American carriers that intelligence suggested were fleeing westward. The reconnaissance missions were dangerous, flying alone over enemy-controlled waters at night, navigating by dead reckoning, vulnerable to interception by American fighters if spotted. And one reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American ships approximately 150 miles southeast of the Japanese fleet, but the report was vague and possibly inaccurate. Atmospheric interference garbled radio transmissions. Navigation errors were common at night. Admiral Kondo received the report with appropriate skepticism. Intelligence suggested American carriers were withdrawing, but whether this represented genuine retreat or tactical repositioning remained uncertain. He ordered his fleet to maintain current position through the night, awaiting better reconnaissance information at dawn. Admiral Fletcher spent the night in Saratoga's flag plot, monitoring damage control progress and contemplating his next moves. Saratoga would be out of action for months. An Enterprise and Wasp remained operational, but were now facing a Japanese fleet that had proven its ability to strike at long range with coordinated precision. The tactical situation demanded caution. Fletcher could not afford to lose another carrier. The American strategic objective, preventing Japanese forces from seizing Guadalcanal, had been partially achieved. The Japanese transport operation had been disrupted. Japanese carrier forces had suffered casualties. But the battle remained unresolved. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Neither side had been forced to abandon the theater completely. The dawn would bring new reconnaissance missions, new intelligence assessments, new decisions about whether to continue fighting or withdraw. Fletcher pulled out a notepad and began writing preliminary after-action notes, all knowing that whatever happened tomorrow, this battle would be studied for lessons about carrier warfare for years to come. By 3 o'clock in the morning, an exhausted calm settled over both fleets. Damage control teams had done everything possible to repair battle damage and restore combat capability. Pilots who would fly at dawn were sleeping fitfully in their bunks. Gun crews maintained their watches, scanning dark skies for enemy aircraft that were unlikely to appear. The silent hours between major combat engagements were in some ways harder than the combat itself. Action provided focus, purpose, clear objectives. The waiting between engagements provided only uncertainty, doubt, and the knowledge that morning would bring renewed danger. Sailors smoked cigarettes on darkened decks, spoke in quiet voices. They thought about home and wondered if they would survive to see it again. The battle's second day was approaching, and no one knew what it would bring except that more men would die, and more ships would be damaged in the continuing struggle for control of the Solomon Islands. July 25th, 1942, 2:30 in the morning. A Japanese reconnaissance aircraft climbed away from Shokaku's flight deck into moonless darkness, beginning a search mission that would cover 300 nautical miles of empty ocean. Lieutenant Masao Yamaguchi piloted the twin-engine reconnaissance plane, navigating by compass and dead reckoning toward the area where intelligence believed American carriers had withdrawn. His orders were specific: locate the American fleet, report its position and composition, avoid combat. The mission was dangerous beyond the obvious risks of night flying. If Yamaguchi located American carriers, they would detect his aircraft on radar long before he could visually identify them. American fighters might intercept him. If forced to evade, he might lose his navigation reference and be unable to find his way back to Shokaku. If his radio failed, any intelligence he gathered would die with him. Yet the mission was necessary. Admiral Kondo needed accurate information about American positions before committing to continued combat operations or withdrawing his carriers northward to safety. Yamaguchi reached his search area at 4 o'clock and began a methodical square search pattern, scanning the ocean below for shipwakes that would appear as phosphorescent lines against dark water. At 4:30, he spotted what appeared to be multiple ships moving in formation approximately 100 miles southeast of his position. He altered course to investigate, approaching cautiously to confirm the sighting. At 4:45, he radioed Shokaku with his report. American task force sighted bearing 140 degrees, distance 200 kilometers, course west, speed approximately 15 knots. Task force appears to include 2 carriers with multiple escort vessels. The report was transmitted in encrypted burst transmission, brief enough to avoid American radio direction finding, but detailed enough to provide actionable intelligence. Yamaguchi turned north and accelerated toward Shokaku, satisfied he had accomplished his mission. He had no way of knowing his report contained critical errors. Those of the ships Yamaguchi had spotted were not American carriers, but a group of American cruisers and destroyers that had been positioned to screen against Japanese surface attacks. The formation's defensive pattern, viewed from high altitude at night, resembled a carrier task force's typical arrangement. The presence of 2 large ships, heavy cruisers rather than carriers, reinforced the misidentification. Yamaguchi's report, though made in good faith, was fundamentally incorrect. This error would cascade through the Japanese command structure, creating false confidence that American carriers had been located and accurately tracked. Admiral Kondo received the report at 5:15 and immediately began planning follow-up reconnaissance missions to maintain contact with the reported American force. His intelligence officers marked the position on their plotting charts and calculated intercept courses for potential strike missions at dawn. American search aircraft launched from Enterprise at 6 o'clock, conducting their own reconnaissance sweeps to locate the Japanese fleet. The search pattern covered sectors northwest through northeast of Enterprise's position, the areas where intelligence suggested Japanese carriers had operated the previous day. 20 Dauntless dive bombers flew individual search corridors, each aircraft responsible for scanning a 10-degree sector out to a distance of 250 nautical miles. Lieutenant Samuel Adams flew the northernmost search corridor, navigating by compass, bearing toward coordinates provided during his pre-flight briefing. At 6:45, he spotted ships on the horizon, multiple large vessels with escort destroyers moving in formation. Adams transmitted his sighting report. 2 battleships bearing 330 degrees from Point Z, distance 140 miles, course southeast, speed 20 knots. Adams's report triggered immediate reactions aboard Enterprise. Plotting officers marked the position. Intelligence officers attempted to correlate the sighting with expected Japanese force dispositions. Admiral Fletcher's staff debated whether the reported battleships might actually be carriers misidentified at long range. The debate consumed 20 minutes, during which Adams was flying back toward Enterprise and could not provide additional clarification. At 7:10, a second reconnaissance aircraft transmitted a different sighting report. 4 cruisers and multiple destroyers bearing 015 degrees from Point Z, distance 100 miles, course southwest. The 2 reports placed Japanese forces in completely different locations, moving on divergent courses. Either one pilot had made a navigation error, or the Japanese fleet had divided into multiple task groups, or both reports were identifying different subsets of the same overall force. Admiral Fletcher convened an emergency staff meeting at 7:30 to evaluate the conflicting reconnaissance reports. His intelligence officer presented 3 possible interpretations. First, the Japanese fleet might have divided, with some forces moving to attack American positions, while others withdrew northward. Second, all one or both reconnaissance reports might be inaccurate due to navigation errors or misidentification of ship types. Third, the Japanese might be conducting deliberate deception, maneuvering to confuse American search efforts while positioning for surprise attacks. Fletcher had no way to determine which interpretation was correct without additional reconnaissance. He ordered more search aircraft launched to clarify the situation, but the additional searches would require 90 minutes to reach the reported positions and transmit updated information. Those 90 minutes represented time during which the Japanese could close within striking range of American carriers. Lieutenant Commander William Ault launched from Saratoga at 7:45, flying one of the additional reconnaissance missions Fletcher had ordered. Ault commanded Saratoga's scouting squadron, had extensive experience in long-range searches, understood the critical importance of accurate position reporting. His assigned search sector covered the area where the first reconnaissance pilot had reported battleships. Ault found empty ocean. He extended his search, flying beyond his assigned sector, scanning continuously for any sign of Japanese ships. At 8:15, he spotted what appeared to be cruisers and destroyers, but no battleships or carriers. He transmitted an updated report. Previous battleship report appears inaccurate. Current sighting shows 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers bearing 345 degrees from Point Z, distance 120 miles. This report directly contradicted the earlier sighting, creating more confusion rather than clarification. The cascade of contradictory reconnaissance reports created paralysis in both fleets' command structures. American commanders did not know where the main Japanese carrier force was located. Japanese commanders believed they were tracking American carriers, but were actually following cruisers. Both sides launched additional reconnaissance missions, consuming aircraft and pilot fatigue without gaining tactical clarity. The fundamental problem was that ocean reconnaissance from single-engine aircraft was inherently unreliable. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, estimating positions based on compass bearings, elapsed time, and airspeed calculations that were affected by wind drift and compass errors. Ship identification from high altitude required experience and clear visibility. Weather, haze, and stress all contributed to errors. Yes, a cruiser seen from 15,000 feet might resemble a carrier. A transport group might be misidentified as a carrier task force. These errors were inevitable, but their consequences could be catastrophic. By 9 o'clock, Admiral Fletcher had received 6 different reconnaissance reports, none of which agreed on the location or composition of Japanese forces. His operations officer attempted to plot all the sightings on a single chart, resulting in a confused picture of reported Japanese positions scattered across 200 miles of ocean. Fletcher faced the classic command decision under uncertainty. He could launch strikes against the most promising reported positions, risking that his aircraft would waste ordnance attacking secondary targets or empty ocean. He could wait for additional reconnaissance to clarify the situation, and in accepting the risk that delay might allow the Japanese to attack first. Or he could withdraw his carriers eastward, preserving them for future operations, but abandoning the immediate objective of contesting Japanese control near Guadalcanal. None of these options was obviously correct. All involved accepting risks that could prove disastrous. Admiral Kondo was wrestling with similar uncertainties. His night reconnaissance had reported American carriers moving westward. His dawn reconnaissance reported American ships in multiple locations, some reports suggesting carriers, other reports describing cruisers and destroyers. Were the Americans concentrating their forces or dispersing? Were they preparing for attacks or withdrawing? Kondo's experience suggested the Americans were conducting deception operations, using cruiser groups to simulate carrier task forces while the real carriers maneuvered to attack positions. He ordered his carrier forces to maintain defensive formations, while launching additional reconnaissance to locate the American carriers with certainty. This decision-making paralysis consumed hours during which both fleets maneuvered cautiously, neither willing to commit to major operations without better intelligence. The phantom fleets that dominated both sides' intelligence assessments on the morning of July the 25th represented the fog of war at its most profound. Neither commander had clear understanding of enemy positions or intentions. Both were operating based on fragmentary and contradictory information. Both understood that mistakes could cost carriers and thousands of lives. The result was caution on both sides, and a mutual unwillingness to commit fully to attack without confirmation that would never arrive with absolute certainty. By mid-morning, the battle had evolved into a reconnaissance war, with each side launching search aircraft to find enemy forces while simultaneously trying to avoid being found. The phantom fleets would continue to haunt both commanders' decision-making for the remainder of the battle, creating a situation where information superiority, the advantage American code-breaking had supposedly provided, dissolved into tactical confusion that no amount of intelligence could penetrate. July 25th, 1942, 7:50 in the morning. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kinugasa steamed at 28 knots approximately 100 miles northwest of Guadalcanal, her mission being to provide gunfire support for Japanese transport operations, while remaining within air defense range of Shokaku and Zuikaku. Commander Masao Sawa stood on Kinugasa's bridge and watched his radar operators tracking multiple aircraft contacts approaching from the southeast. The contacts were at high altitude, moving at speeds consistent with American dive bombers. Sawa ordered general quarters immediately and began evasive maneuvers, swinging the cruiser through hard turns designed to complicate bombing accuracy. Kinugasa had survived multiple battles since the war's beginning, had participated in operations from Java to the Solomons, had earned a reputation as a fortunate ship. That fortune was about to be tested against one of the most concentrated American attacks of the entire battle. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led the American strike force approaching Kinugasa and her accompanying vessels. His formation included 15 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Saratoga, 7 Wildcat fighters for escort, and specific orders to attack any Japanese surface ships located in the search area. Leslie had spotted Kinugasa's group at 7:45, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers moving in defensive formation. This was not the primary target American commanders wanted. They still sought the elusive Japanese fleet carriers, but it was a legitimate military objective. Heavy cruisers provided critical support for Japanese operations, could bombard shore positions, could engage American surface forces, could survive multiple bomb hits and remain operational. Destroying them would degrade Japanese operational capability, even if it did not achieve the decisive carrier kill that dominated American strategic thinking. Leslie's attack plan was textbook carrier aviation doctrine. Fighters would sweep ahead, suppressing anti-aircraft fire and engaging any Japanese combat air patrol. Dive bombers would attack from different directions simultaneously, splitting Japanese defensive fire and increasing the probability of hits. Each bomber carried a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, designed to penetrate a cruiser's deck armor and detonate inside the hull, causing maximum damage to machinery, spaces, and magazines. The attack would be violent, brief, and hopefully decisive. Leslie signaled the attack order at 8:15, and his formation split into separate attacking elements. 4 fighters dove toward Kinugasa, strafing the cruiser's anti-aircraft positions. The dive bombers circled to gain altitude separation, then began their attack runs from 14,000 feet. Commander Sawa watched the American bombers positioning for their dives and understood he had perhaps 30 seconds to prepare. Kinugasa's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately, creating a barrage of steel through which the attackers would have to fly. The cruiser mounted 8 5-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 32 25mm anti-aircraft guns in 8 quad mounts, and numerous smaller weapons. These weapons created an impressive volume of fire, but suffered from significant limitations. The 5-inch guns lacked proximity fuses, meaning their shells had to be individually timed to explode at specific altitudes. The 25mm weapons were manually aimed, making them ineffective against aircraft diving at 400 miles per hour. The result was defensive fire that looked spectacular but achieved limited results. American bombers pressed through the barrage, maintaining formation discipline despite watching tracer fire passing within feet of their aircraft. The first bomb struck Kinugasa at 8:20, hitting the cruiser's quarterdeck and penetrating through 2 decks before exploding in a crew compartment. The explosion killed 20 sailors instantly and started fires in adjacent spaces. A second bomb hit amidships, striking near the cruiser's mainmast and destroying communication equipment that linked Kinugasa with her accompanying vessels. A third bomb struck forward, penetrating into a magazine space but miraculously failing to detonate the stored ammunition. This dude bomb nevertheless caused significant damage through impact shock, buckling deck plates, and rupturing water mains. Damage control teams responded immediately, fighting fires, controlling flooding, attempting to restore communications and propulsion. Commander Sawa maintained command from the bridge despite smoke obscuring visibility and secondary explosions shaking the ship. His immediate assessment was that Kinugasa could survive if no additional bombs struck critical spaces. The second wave of attackers arrived at 8:35. American dive bombers that had circled to gain additional altitude now dove on Kinugasa from a different bearing, forcing Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to shift their fire and creating momentary gaps in the defensive barrage. 2 more bombs struck the cruiser, one hitting near the bow and opening a large hole below the waterline, the second striking aft and destroying the starboard propeller shaft. Flooding accelerated. The cruiser's list increased to 10 degrees. Speed dropped to 15 knots. Sawa recognized that his ship was dying. The combination of bomb damage, flooding, and fires had overwhelmed damage control capabilities. At 8:45, he gave the order to abandon ship, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life, but that saved hundreds of lives. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, steaming 5 miles east of Kinugasa, came under similar attack at 8:40. All American torpedo bombers and dive bombers attacked simultaneously from different directions, the torpedo bombers approaching at wave height, while dive bombers screamed down from 12,000 feet. Chikuma's captain executed violent evasive maneuvers, throwing the cruiser into turns so sharp that sailors on deck struggled to maintain footing. 2 torpedoes missed narrowly. A third torpedo struck Chikuma amidships on the port side, the explosion tearing a 20-foot hole in the hull and flooding 2 machinery spaces. 2 bombs struck the cruiser moments later, one destroying a gun mount, the second hitting near the forward superstructure and causing extensive casualties among crew members manning exposed positions. Chikuma remained afloat and capable of limited operations. But the damage was severe enough to require withdrawal from combat operations. Lieutenant Commander William Ault, who had been conducting reconnaissance missions earlier that morning, participated in the attack on Chikuma, despite his aircraft being intended for search rather than combat. He pressed his attack at dangerously low altitude, released his torpedo at 900 yards, well within the optimal range, but also within effective anti-aircraft fire range. His torpedo struck Chikuma near the bow, causing additional flooding that compounded the damage from the earlier torpedo hit. As Ault climbed away from his attack, Japanese anti-aircraft fire struck his Dauntless, punching holes through the wing and fuselage, severing control cables, damaging the engine. Ault struggled to maintain control, and coaxing his crippled aircraft away from the Japanese cruisers toward Enterprise's last known position. His radio operator transmitted damage reports and requested emergency assistance. Ault knew he could not reach Enterprise, that fuel loss and engine damage would force ditching in the ocean, that rescue was uncertain at best. He flew as far as possible, transmitted his final position at 9:15, then executed a controlled ditching 30 miles from the nearest American destroyer. Neither Ault nor his radio operator survived. American aircraft losses during the cruiser engagement totaled 10 bombers and torpedo planes lost to anti-aircraft fire, operational accidents, or fuel exhaustion. 20 pilots and aircrew members were killed or listed as missing. Japanese losses included Kinugasa sinking at 9:30, or approximately 400 sailors rescued by destroyers, but 150 lost when the ship went down. Chikuma survived but required months of repairs and was effectively removed from combat operations. The light cruiser and destroyers accompanying the heavy cruisers suffered minor damage but remained operational. The strategic calculus of the engagement revealed the battle's fundamental pattern, both sides trading losses without achieving decisive victory. Americans had destroyed one heavy cruiser and damaged another, but these were secondary targets. The Japanese fleet carriers remained unlocated and undamaged. Admiral Fletcher received after-action reports from the cruiser engagement at 10 o'clock and faced renewed frustration about the battle's direction. His aircraft had successfully attacked Japanese surface forces. That had demonstrated that American pilots could press attacks through heavy defensive fire, had sunk a valuable enemy ship. But the primary objective, locating and destroying Japanese fleet carriers, remained unfulfilled. Reconnaissance aircraft continued searching, but the vastness of the ocean and the limitations of single aircraft searches meant that Japanese carriers could avoid detection simply by maneuvering unpredictably and maintaining radio silence. Fletcher understood that he was fighting a battle where tactical successes did not necessarily lead to strategic victory. Sinking cruisers degraded Japanese capabilities, but did not fundamentally change the balance of carrier power that would determine the Pacific War's outcome. The cruiser fight had been won, but the carrier battle that mattered most remained unresolved and increasingly unlikely as both fleets maneuvered cautiously to avoid catastrophic losses. July 25, 1942, 11:30 in the morning. Lieutenant James Gray climbed out of his Dauntless dive bomber's cockpit aboard USS Enterprise and nearly collapsed from exhaustion. He had flown 4 combat sorties in the past 20 hours, reconnaissance at dawn, an attack on Japanese cruisers at mid-morning, combat air patrol in the afternoon, and another reconnaissance sweep that had just concluded. His legs trembled as he walked across the flight deck toward the ready room. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. The ready room debriefing officer asked standard post-flight questions about what Gray had seen, where he had flown, whether he had encountered enemy forces. Gray struggled to remember details that 12 hours earlier would have been crystal clear. The mission tracks blurred together. The positions and sightings merged into a confused jumble. He was not alone in this condition. Across both American and Japanese fleets, pilots were reaching the limits of human endurance. The physical toll of carrier operations had become a critical factor, limiting both sides' combat effectiveness. Each combat sortie imposed specific stresses on pilots: the adrenaline surge of takeoff from a moving carrier deck, the mental concentration required for navigation across featureless ocean, the terror of combat where split-second mistakes meant death, the physical strain of high-G maneuvers during dogfights or attack runs, That's the psychological pressure of landing back aboard a carrier with minimal fuel reserves. A single combat sortie left pilots depleted. 4 or 5 sorties in rapid succession left them incapable of functioning effectively. Reaction times slowed, decision-making deteriorated. Situational awareness collapsed. Pilots who would normally spot the enemy aircraft at 5 miles might miss them at 1 mile. Formation disciplines suffered as exhausted pilots struggled to maintain position. The cumulative effect was that air groups that appeared combat-ready on paper were actually approaching operational collapse from human factors rather than material losses. Admiral Fletcher's air operations officer reported at noon that American fighter strength had declined to critical levels. Enterprise had begun the battle with 40 Wildcat fighters. The current operational strength was 15 aircraft. The losses included 8 fighters shot down in combat, 4 destroyed by operational accidents during recovery, 3 damaged beyond shipboard repair capabilities, and 10 rendered temporarily non-operational due to mechanical issues or battle damage requiring extended maintenance. Saratoga's fighter strength had declined to 0 operational aircraft after the carrier's torpedo damage forced withdrawal. Wasp still possessed 30 fighters, but the carrier's air group had not yet engaged in major combat, and its pilots lacked the combat experience of Enterprise's surviving aviators. The overall fighter situation meant that American carriers could maintain combat air patrol, but had limited reserves for escorting strikes or responding to unexpected threats. A Japanese aircraft availability had declined similarly. Admiral Kondo received reports at 1 o'clock showing that Shokaku and Zuikaku combined possessed approximately 40 combat-capable aircraft, 20 fighters, 15 dive bombers, 5 torpedo bombers. These numbers represented roughly half of the carrier's normal air group strength. The losses included aircraft shot down by American fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or lost to operational accidents and mechanical failures. More concerning than the aircraft losses were the pilot casualties. 12 experienced pilots had been killed during the previous day's strike against American carriers. Another 8 had been killed or gone missing during the cruiser engagement that morning. 5 were wounded too severely to continue flying. The remaining pilots showed signs of extreme fatigue, difficulty concentrating during briefings, slower reaction times during flight operations, increased error rates during landing approaches. Kondo's air operations officer warned that continuing combat operations risked losing additional aircraft and pilots to exhaustion-related accidents rather than enemy action. At 1:15, Admiral Kondo made a critical decision. He would launch one final coordinated strike against reported American carrier positions, committing approximately 35 aircraft, the maximum force his carriers could assemble given current availability and pilot condition. This strike would be the decisive effort. If it succeeded in crippling or destroying American carriers, the battle would be won, and Japanese control over the Solomons secured. If it failed, both Japanese carriers would have insufficient aircraft and pilots remaining for further combat operations, and would need to withdraw northward to Rabaul for reconstitution. The strike force began forming up at 1:30, pilots receiving briefings on target positions, attack coordination, and fuel considerations. The briefing officer emphasized that this would be an extreme-range mission with minimal fuel reserves for combat or evasion. Pilots nodded silently, too tired to express the fear they all felt. American Combat Air Patrol intercepted the Japanese strike force at 2 o'clock, approximately 30 miles northwest of Enterprise. The ensuing engagement was chaotic and indecisive. American fighters claimed 8 Japanese aircraft destroyed, though actual kills were probably closer to 4 or 5. Eddie Japanese escorts claimed 6 American fighters destroyed, actual kills being 3 or 4. The more significant effect was that the interception disrupted the Japanese strike force's coordination. Bombers and torpedo planes became separated. Formation integrity collapsed as aircraft maneuvered to evade American fighters. By the time the Japanese aircraft reached the area where reconnaissance had reported American carriers, the formation was scattered across 20 miles of sky and had lost the coordination necessary for effective attack. Several Japanese bombers attacked what they believed was a carrier, but turned out to be a heavy cruiser. Others searched for targets, found nothing, and jettisoned their ordnance to improve fuel economy for the return flight. The strike that was supposed to be decisive accomplished almost nothing. The Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers between 3:30 and 5 o'clock, landing in failing light under marginal weather conditions. 2 aircraft crashed during landing attempts, killing their crews. 3 others ditched near the carriers after running out of fuel, their crews rescued by destroyers. 1 aircraft was so badly damaged that it was pushed overboard after landing to prevent it from blocking the flight deck. Pilot debriefings revealed the mission's failure. Targets had not been located, attacks had been ineffective, coordination had broken down. Admiral Kondo listened to these reports and accepted that the battle had reached its conclusion. His carriers could not continue offensive operations without risking complete exhaustion of their air groups. Ihai issued orders for Shokaku and Zuikaku to withdraw northward toward Rabaul, breaking contact with American forces and ending the carrier engagement phase of the battle. Admiral Fletcher reached similar conclusions about American capabilities. Enterprise had mounted sustained combat operations for 48 hours. The ship's air group was depleted. Pilots were exhausted. Aircraft required maintenance that could not be performed at sea. Wasp remained relatively fresh, but had not yet proven itself in major combat operations. The strategic objective, preventing Japanese seizure of Guadalcanal, had been partially achieved. Japanese transport operations had been disrupted. Japanese carriers had been forced to withdraw, but American forces were in no condition to pursue or to launch sustained operations near Guadalcanal. F. Fletcher ordered his task force to withdraw eastward, maintaining position approximately 200 miles from Guadalcanal while conducting limited reconnaissance missions. The battle was ending, not with decisive victory for either side, but with mutual exhaustion and recognition that neither fleet could continue fighting without risking catastrophic losses. The night of July 25th brought relief to exhausted sailors and pilots throughout both fleets. Combat operations ceased. Ships maintained defensive formations but did not maneuver aggressively. Flight operations were limited to essential combat air patrol. Damage control teams completed repairs on ships that had been damaged during the previous 48 hours. Medical personnel treated wounded sailors and pilots. Mess crews prepared meals for men who had survived on coffee and emergency rations during extended combat periods. The temporary peace was psychological as much as physical. Sailors who had expected to die during the past 2 days gradually accepted that they might survive. Pilots who had flown sortie after sortie while watching squadron mates get shot down allowed themselves to imagine returning home someday. The battle had faded, not through clear victory or defeat, but through the simple human reality that no one could continue fighting indefinitely without rest. Admiral Kondo transmitted his after-action report to Admiral Yamamoto's headquarters at Rabaul during the early morning hours of July 26th. The report acknowledged that American carriers remained operational, that Japanese forces had been unable to achieve decisive victory, that the Solomons operation would need to be reconsidered in light of stronger than expected American naval opposition. Yamamoto's response arrived at dawn. Withdraw to Rabaul, reconstitute air groups, prepare for future operations pending strategic assessment. The orders confirmed what Kondo already knew. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had ended without clear resolution. Japanese forces had fought bravely, had inflicted damage on American ships, had demonstrated continuing capability to challenge American naval power, but they had not achieved the decisive carrier battle that Japanese doctrine demanded. The fade from combat to withdrawal reflected the brutal reality that naval battles, unlike land campaigns, rarely ended with clear victories. They ended when both sides recognized they had reached the limits of what could be accomplished without risking losses that would undermine future operations. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had reached that limit, and both fleets turned away from each other, leaving historians to debate who won and what it meant. July 25, 1942, 11 o'clock at night. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood alone on USS Saratoga's flag bridge, watching phosphorescent wakes trail behind the carrier as it steamed slowly westward. The ship's reduced speed, limited to 20 knots by torpedo damage, created a tactical vulnerability that dominated his thinking. Saratoga could not adequately evade submarine attacks at this speed. It could not keep pace with the faster Enterprise and Wasp. Most critically, it could not operate aircraft safely in light wind conditions, because carriers needed to steam at high speed into the wind to generate sufficient airflow across the flight deck for safe launches and recoveries. Fletcher had already ordered Saratoga to withdraw toward Pearl Harbor for repairs, but his broader strategic decision remained unresolved. Should he continue operations near Guadalcanal with his two remaining operational carriers, accepting the risk of further combat against Japanese forces that remained dangerous despite 2 days of battle? Or should he withdraw the entire task force eastward, preserving his carriers for future operations, but effectively ceding the waters around Guadalcanal to Japanese control? The intelligence reports arriving throughout the evening painted a confused picture of Japanese intentions. Radio intercepts suggested that Japanese carriers were withdrawing northward, but the intercepts were fragmentary and possibly deceptive. Reconnaissance aircraft had spotted Japanese surface forces approximately 70 miles north of Guadalcanal, moving in formation that suggested offensive operations rather than withdrawal. American submarines reported detecting Japanese ships transiting through channels between the Solomon Islands, though whether these were combat vessels or transports remained unclear. Fletcher's intelligence officer attempted to synthesize these disparate reports into a coherent assessment, but ultimately could only offer probability estimates rather than certainties. There was a 60% probability that Japanese carriers had withdrawn. There was a 40% probability that Japanese surface forces were positioning for night engagement. There was an 80% probability that Japanese transport operations to Guadalcanal would resume within 48 hours, regardless of carrier movements. Fletcher's chief of staff entered the flag bridge at 11:15 and presented the tactical factors influencing the decision. American carrier strength consisted of 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Wasp, with approximately 65 combat-capable aircraft between them. Japanese carrier strength remained uncertain, but was estimated at 2 operational fleet carriers with approximately 40 to 50 aircraft. American surface forces included the battleship North Carolina, 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers. Japanese surface forces included multiple heavy cruisers, the battleship IAI, and approximately 15 destroyers. The surface force balance slightly favored the Americans in total firepower, but heavily favored the Japanese in night combat capability. Japanese type S-93 long lance torpedoes could engage targets at 22 kilometers, more than twice the range of American torpedoes. Japanese crews had trained extensively for night surface combat. American doctrine emphasized avoiding night engagements where Japanese advantages would be decisive. The fuel situation added another constraint to Fletcher's decision-making. Enterprise and Wasp were at approximately 60% fuel capacity, sufficient for 3 to 4 days of sustained operations, before requiring replenishment from tankers positioned several hundred miles to the rear. The screening destroyers were at lower fuel states, some as low as 40% capacity. Extended high-speed maneuvering during combat operations consumed fuel at rates that could quickly leave destroyers unable to maintain formation with the carriers. Fletcher's logistics officer estimated that continuing combat operations for more than 48 additional hours would require either accepting significantly reduced destroyer screens, increasing submarine vulnerability, or detaching destroyers to replenish fuel, reducing the task force's anti-aircraft defense capability. Either choice created tactical weaknesses that Japanese forces could exploit. Admiral Kondo faced parallel decision-making challenges aboard his flagship Chokai, approximately 200 miles north of Fletcher's position. His carriers had withdrawn northward, but his surface forces remained capable of night operations against American positions. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive surface action, using superior night fighting capabilities to engage enemy forces when American air superiority was neutralized by darkness. Kondo possessed the heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya, the battleship Hiei with 14-inch guns, and destroyer forces under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka. This surface force could sweep south during the night, engage any American ships near Guadalcanal, bombard American positions ashore if no naval targets were found, and withdraw northward before dawn, brought the threat of American air attack. The potential gains were significant. Destroying American cruisers or damaging carriers would shift the naval balance decisively, but the risks were equally significant. The American radar gave them advantage in detecting approaching Japanese forces. American submarines might intercept the Japanese formation. Most critically, committing surface forces to night action would prevent them from screening Japanese transport operations scheduled to resume within days. Fletcher made his decision at 2 o'clock in the morning on July 26th. He would withdraw his carrier task force eastward, maintaining position approximately 200 miles from Guadalcanal, but ceasing active offensive operations. His reasoning was documented in the night orders he issued to his task force. Enemy carrier forces have withdrawn northward. Enemy surface forces remain in theater, but their positions are uncertain. American carrier forces have sustained damage and exhaustion that limits combat capability. Continuing operations near Guadalcanal accepts unacceptable risk of carrier loss to night surface action or submarine attack. Will maintain distant position, enabling response to major enemy carrier operations while preserving force integrity for future campaigns. The orders were pragmatic, cautious, and defensible by any standard of prudent naval command. They were also controversial decisions that would be debated for decades. The withdrawal order transmitted through the American task force at 2:30. Ships altered course eastward, increasing speed to 25 knots, maintaining defensive formation with destroyers screening ahead and on the flanks. Enterprise and Wasp positioned themselves at the formation center, surrounded by protective rings of cruisers and destroyers. The battleship North Carolina steamed 5 miles ahead, its massive bulk serving as an additional screen against submarine attack. Sailors throughout the task force reacted to the withdrawal orders with mixed feelings. Some felt relief that the immediate danger of combat had passed. Others felt frustration that the battle was ending without clear victory. A few felt that withdrawing meant abandoning the Marines, who would soon land on Guadalcanal to seize the Japanese-held airfield. All understood that naval battles rarely ended with the clarity of land campaigns. Ships withdrew, regrouped, repaired damage, and prepared for the next engagement. The cycle would continue until one side achieved overwhelming superiority, or both sides exhausted their capacity to continue fighting. And Admiral Kondo received reports at 3 o'clock that American radio traffic suggested the enemy task force was withdrawing eastward. His communications intelligence officers could not decrypt the American messages, but could analyze transmission patterns, frequencies, and signal strengths to estimate American ship movements. The pattern was consistent with withdrawal rather than maneuver for attack. Kondo considered pursuing with his surface forces, but ultimately decided against night action. His reasoning mirrored Fletcher's in reverse. American radar capabilities gave them advantage in detecting approaching Japanese ships. The darkness that neutralized American air power also complicated Japanese navigation and coordination. Engaging American forces without knowing their exact positions risked stumbling into an ambiguous meeting engagement where superior American radar might provide decisive advantage. More importantly, Kondo's surface forces were needed to screen the resumption of Japanese transport operations to Guadalcanal. Committing them to a night surface sweep would prevent them from fulfilling that critical mission. The parallel decisions by Fletcher and Kondo to avoid night surface engagement reflected how both admirals understood the battle's strategic context. Neither could afford to lose major fleet units for uncertain gains. Japanese carriers had already withdrawn northward, removing the threat that justified aggressive American action. American carriers were withdrawing eastward, removing the targets that justified aggressive Japanese action. The transport operations that represented the battle's actual strategic objective, supplying and reinforcing Guadalcanal, could continue regardless of whether the carrier fleets fought to mutual destruction. Both admirals understood that preserving their forces for future battles was more important than risking everything for potentially decisive but unlikely victory in a single night engagement. The night decision was fundamentally a choice to accept incomplete tactical results in order to maintain strategic flexibility. By dawn on July 26, both fleets had established positions that effectively ended the carrier engagement phase of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. American carriers were approximately 250 miles east of Guadalcanal, conducting limited reconnaissance but not preparing offensive strikes. Yet Japanese carriers were approximately 300 miles north of Guadalcanal, screening transport routes but not positioning for renewed carrier operations. Japanese surface forces controlled the waters immediately around Guadalcanal at night. American air forces would control the same waters during daylight hours. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Neither side had suffered catastrophic defeat. The battle had reached its natural conclusion, the point where continuing combat risked losses disproportionate to potential gains. Fletcher's night decision to withdraw would be criticized by some historians as overcautious, praised by others as prudent. The debate would continue for generations, but the decision itself was irreversible. The battle was over. The consequences remained to be assessed. August 1st, 1942. Commander Edwin Layton sat in his office at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, compiling casualty reports and loss assessments from the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The reports arrived in fragments, messages from ships, debriefing transcripts from surviving pilots, reconnaissance photographs of damaged vessels, intelligence summaries from Station Hypo. Layton's task was synthesizing these fragments into a coherent accounting of what the battle had cost both sides. The numbers emerging from his analysis told a story that defied simple interpretation. By traditional metrics of naval warfare, ships sunk, tonnage destroyed, the battle appeared to be a modest American victory. Japan had lost the light carrier Ryujo and the heavy cruiser Kinugasa sunk, plus the heavy cruiser Chikuma damaged and requiring months of repairs. That America had lost no ships sunk, though Saratoga was heavily damaged and would be out of action for at least 5 months. But these traditional metrics obscured more important factors that would influence the Pacific War's trajectory. The aircraft loss comparison revealed a more complex picture. Japanese forces had lost between 55 and 65 aircraft during the battle, though exact numbers remained uncertain because some aircraft listed as missing might have crashed at sea far from observers. American forces had lost between 20 and 25 aircraft. The roughly 2-to-1 loss ratio favored America, but that statistical advantage was misleading. American aircraft production in 1942 was running at approximately 2,500 aircraft per month across all types. Replacing 25 lost carrier aircraft represented less than 1% of monthly production. Japanese aircraft production was running at approximately 300 carrier-suitable aircraft per month. Replacing 60 aircraft represented 20% of monthly production. More critically, the aircraft themselves were less important than the production capacity and industrial infrastructure behind them. America's aircraft industry was expanding rapidly, immune to enemy attack and supported by vast raw material resources. Japan's aircraft industry was operating near maximum capacity, vulnerable to strategic bombing if American forces ever reached within range, and increasingly constrained by raw material shortages. The pilot casualty analysis revealed the battle's true strategic significance. All American forces had lost approximately 23 pilots and aircrew members killed or missing. Most of these losses occurred when aircraft were shot down over water, and several pilots were rescued by destroyers positioned for that purpose. The survival rate for American pilots who ditched near American ships was approximately 50%. Not good odds, but better than the near-zero survival rate for pilots who ditched in enemy-controlled waters. Japanese forces had lost approximately 60 experienced pilots killed or missing. The survival rate for Japanese pilots was significantly lower because Japanese doctrine did not emphasize rescue operations to the same degree as American doctrine. More importantly, Japanese pilots who were shot down over water, far from Japanese ships, had virtually no chance of rescue. The human cost was staggering. 60 men who had trained for years, who possessed irreplaceable combat experience, who represented institutional knowledge that could not be quickly reconstructed. Commander Layton's analysis included specific case studies that illustrated the pilot loss differential. Lieutenant Wade McCluskey, who had led the attack on Ryujo, survived the battle and would eventually be rotated back to the United States for a training assignment. His combat experience would be passed to new pilots, multiplying the value of his survival. By contrast, a Japanese pilot of equivalent experience who was killed at Eastern Solomons took all his knowledge to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. No Japanese equivalent of the American pilot rotation system existed. All Japanese pilots flew until they were killed or too badly wounded to continue. The institutional knowledge they accumulated, understanding of American tactics, experience with combat stress management, technical expertise with their aircraft, died with them. This asymmetry in pilot management would compound over time, creating a death spiral where each battle killed Japan's best pilots while training their replacements through the wasteful method of learning by dying. The material accounting extended beyond aircraft and ships to include ordnance expenditure, fuel consumption, and maintenance requirements. American carriers had expended approximately 200 bombs and torpedoes during the battle, representing a moderate draw on stockpiles that were being constantly replenished from American factories. Japanese carriers had expended similar amounts but faced more significant logistical challenges in replenishment. Every bomb and torpedo used at Eastern Solomons was one less bomb or torpedo available for future battles, and Japanese production rates were barely sufficient to maintain stockpile levels against operational consumption. Fuel consumption told a similar story. American carriers operating near Guadalcanal were within range of fleet oilers that could transit safely from rear area bases. Japanese carriers operating from Rabaul were at the extreme end of their logistical tether, where every gallon of fuel consumed had to be transported thousands of miles from Japan through waters increasingly patrolled by American submarines. The assessment of damage to surviving ships revealed long-term consequences that would ripple through both fleets for months. Saratoga's torpedo damage would require 5 months of repair at Pearl Harbor, removing approximately 75 aircraft from American carrier strength during that period. But American shipyard capacity was sufficient to complete repairs while simultaneously continuing new construction. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities could work on Saratoga, while other facilities continued building new Essex-class carriers. Japanese shipyard capacity was more constrained. Chikuma's damage would require repairs at either Kure or Yokosuka naval arsenals, facilities that were also needed for new construction and maintenance of other damaged ships. Yet every day that Chikuma occupied a dry dock was a day that facility could not be used for other purposes. The repair queue was becoming a bottleneck in Japanese naval operations, creating situations where damaged ships waited months for repair facilities to become available. The casualty figures, the human cost measured in individual lives rather than statistical aggregates, painted the battle's most sobering picture. American casualties totaled approximately 200 personnel killed or died of wounds. Japanese casualties exceeded 650 killed. These were not abstract numbers, but individual human beings, sailors who had families waiting for them, pilots who had dreams beyond military service, young men whose lives were cut short by decisions made by admirals they would never meet. The casualty lists included names, ranks, all hometowns, next of kin. Reading through them, Leighton was struck by the ages. Most were between 19 and 25 years old. They had barely begun their adult lives when those lives ended in fire, water, or violent impact. The war would produce many more such casualties before it concluded, but each individual death represented an irreplaceable loss to the families and communities these young men had left behind. The strategic assessment Commander Leighton prepared for Admiral Nimitz attempted to distill the battle's significance beyond immediate tactical results. His conclusion was measured, but ultimately positive from the American perspective. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had demonstrated that American carrier forces could contest Japanese naval supremacy in the Southwest Pacific. American pilots, though less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, had proven capable of pressing attacks through heavy defensive fire and achieving tactically significant results. American carriers had survived sustained Japanese air attacks, demonstrating that American damage control doctrine and ship construction methods provided adequate protection. Most importantly, the battle had forced Japanese carriers to withdraw from the Guadalcanal area, creating a window during which American forces could establish themselves ashore without facing overwhelming Japanese air opposition. These outcomes justified the costs incurred, though Leighton was careful to note that the battle had been closer run than public accounts would later suggest. The The Japanese assessment of the battle, reconstructed from intercepted communications and post-war interviews, all reflected different priorities but reached parallel conclusions about the engagement's indecisive nature. Japanese commanders acknowledged that American naval aviation had proven more capable than anticipated. The loss of experienced pilots was recognized as serious but not yet catastrophic. The inability to achieve decisive victory, despite superior pilot experience and effective coordination, was troubling, but attributed to American advantages in radar and the fortunate presence of 3 American carriers versus expectations of only 2. The most significant Japanese concern was logistical. The battle had consumed aircraft and ordnance at rates that were barely sustainable even in the short term. Future battles of similar intensity would rapidly deplete Japanese stockpiles and create shortages that would limit operational flexibility. And Admiral Yamamoto's private assessment, later discovered in his personal papers, concluded that Eastern Solomons had revealed the fundamental strategic problem facing Japan: the inability to achieve decisive victory quickly enough to prevent American industrial superiority from becoming overwhelming. Commander Layton completed his assessment on August 3rd and forwarded it to Admiral Nimitz with a brief cover note. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons represents neither clear victory nor defeat, but rather a demonstration that American naval forces can contest Japanese control of the Southwest Pacific at costs both sides can sustain for the immediate future. The longer-term question is which side can sustain such costs indefinitely. The American industrial advantage suggests favorable long-term outcome if tactical parity can be maintained through the critical next 12 months. Nimitz read the assessment, initialed his approval, and filed it in the growing archive of battle reports that documented the Pacific War's slow progression from desperate defense to eventual offensive. The costs had been counted, the lessons had been extracted, the war continued, and somewhere in the Pacific, young men were preparing for the next battle that would add more names to casualty lists and more numbers to Commander Layton's grim accounting. August 7, 1942. First Lieutenant James Murray crouched in a landing craft approaching Guadalcanal's beaches, part of the 1st Marine Division's assault force designated to seize the Japanese-held airfield. Murray knew nothing about the naval battle that had concluded 2 weeks earlier, except that friendly carriers were supposedly nearby, providing air cover for the landing. What he could not know was how profoundly the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had influenced whether his landing would succeed or end in catastrophic failure. The battle had disrupted Japanese carrier operations near Guadalcanal, creating a window during which American forces could land without facing the overwhelming air attacks that had destroyed so many amphibious operations. Japanese commanders at Rabaul had withdrawn their carriers northward to reconstitute air groups, believing that Guadalcanal could be reinforced by surface ships, and that American forces lacked the capability for major amphibious operations. Both assumptions were about to be proven disastrously wrong. 400 miles north, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka stood on the bridge of his flagship destroyer, reviewing plans for the next Tokyo Express supply run to Guadalcanal. The high-speed nighttime destroyer runs that had earned the nickname Rat Run among American forces represented Japan's adaptation to the changed strategic situation after Eastern Solomons. Japanese carriers could not safely operate near Guadalcanal during daylight due to American air superiority. Japanese transport ships were too slow and vulnerable for daylight transits. Therefore, supplies and reinforcements would be delivered by destroyers that could race south under cover of darkness, unload at Guadalcanal, and retreat northward before dawn brought American air attacks. And each destroyer could carry approximately 50 tons of supplies: ammunition, food, medicine, fuel. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal required approximately 1,000 tons per week to sustain operations. Simple arithmetic revealed the problem. 20 destroyer runs per week were needed, requiring virtually every destroyer in the combined fleet to be committed to supply operations rather than combat missions. The logistics mathematics that dominated Tanaka's planning revealed how. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had created cascading strategic consequences. Before the battle, Japanese plans assumed they could deliver supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal using conventional transport ships escorted by warships, with carrier aviation providing air cover during daylight hours. And Eastern Solomons had disrupted this plan by forcing Japanese carriers to withdraw, leaving transport ships unacceptably vulnerable to American air attack. The Tokyo Express represented a less efficient but more survivable alternative. However, the destroyer runs consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Each round trip from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back consumed approximately 60 tons of fuel oil per destroyer. 20 runs per week meant 1,200 tons of fuel oil, roughly equivalent to the fuel capacity of a large tanker. Every gallon burned on supply runs was one less gallon available for combat operations, creating a logistical vice that would tighten with each passing week. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo received daily reports on the Guadalcanal situation throughout August, and gradually recognized that the campaign was consuming resources far beyond original estimates. The decision to reinforce Guadalcanal rather than withdrawing came on August 9th, after staff officers assessed that abandoning the island would represent an unacceptable loss of prestige and strategic position. The commitment to hold Guadalcanal meant committing forces to a sustained campaign where supply lines stretched thousands of miles and every ton of material had to be delivered under fire. Ships that could have been used for operations in the Central Pacific or Indian Ocean were instead committed to shuttle runs in the Solomons. Aircraft that could have been used to protect convoy routes or support operations in New Guinea were instead committed to defensive patrols over Guadalcanal. The resource drain was inexorable, and it had been triggered by the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, creating conditions where Japanese forces could not easily supply or reinforce their positions. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific headquarters in Australia tracked the Guadalcanal campaign with intense interest mixed with frustration. MacArthur had advocated for an offensive through New Guinea toward the Philippines, arguing that the Solomons represented a strategic backwater that would consume resources without achieving decisive results. The Navy's Guadalcanal operation represented a competing strategic vision that divided American resources between two separate campaigns. MacArthur's staff noted that the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had validated Navy claims that carrier aviation could contest Japanese naval power, but they also noted that the battle had been inconclusive and that sustained operations near Guadalcanal would require continuous naval support that might not be available. The inter-service rivalry that characterized American Pacific strategy throughout the war was intensified by Eastern Solomons' demonstration that both Army and Navy approaches might be viable, but that neither could be fully resourced without shortchanging the other. The supply situation on Guadalcanal itself revealed the battle's practical impact on ground operations. American forces that landed on August 7th found approximately 7,000 Japanese troops on the island, in most of them construction workers and support personnel rather than combat infantry. These Japanese forces had been supplied primarily by conventional transport ships that had arrived before the Battle of the Eastern Solomons disrupted sea lanes. The supply stockpiles included approximately 2 weeks of food, adequate ammunition for defensive operations, and fuel for vehicles and generators. Once the Tokyo Express became the primary supply method, these stockpiles began dwindling faster than they could be replenished. By mid-August, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were experiencing food shortages, and by September, malnutrition was affecting combat effectiveness. The Americans faced similar supply challenges, but had the advantage of air superiority during daylight hours, allowing them to bring in supplies by ship or aircraft without facing the constant threat of air attack that plagued Japanese supply operations. The carrier warfare lessons from Eastern Solomons influenced planning for future Pacific operations throughout late 1942 and early 1943. American commanders recognized that carrier battles were incredibly costly in aircraft and pilots, that tactical coordination remained difficult despite improvements in doctrine, and that achieving decisive victories required overwhelming superiority or exceptional luck. The Navy's carrier force structure planning began emphasizing larger air groups, more carriers concentrated in single task forces, and improved radar and communication systems. The Essex-class carrier program was accelerated, with construction priorities adjusted to deliver new carriers as quickly as possible. Training pipelines were expanded to increase pilot production rates. These adjustments would not show results immediately, but would create the overwhelming American carrier superiority that characterized the Pacific War's final 2 years. Japanese planning underwent similar reassessment, though resource constraints limited the scope of adjustments. The combined fleet staff recognized that pilot attrition at the rate experienced in Eastern Solomons would rapidly deplete the experienced pilot pool that represented Japan's primary military advantage. New training programs attempted to reduce training time while maintaining quality, an impossible goal that resulted in new pilots arriving at operational units with marginal skills. The carrier construction program was reviewed, but shipyard capacity and raw material shortages prevented accelerating production significantly. The strategic assessment concluded that Japan needed to avoid attritional carrier battles and instead seek decisive engagements where superior pilot skill could achieve overwhelming local superiority. This logic would lead directly to the disastrous Philippine Sea engagement in June 1944, where Japanese carrier aviation would be effectively destroyed in what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons' untold impact was ultimately that it established the parameters within which the Guadalcanal campaign would be fought. Neither side achieved the decisive victory that would have allowed them to dominate the Solomons uncontested. Instead, both sides settled into a prolonged struggle where American forces controlled Guadalcanal's airfield and daylight hours, while Japanese forces controlled the surrounding waters at night. This stalemate would persist for 6 months, consuming ships, aircraft, and lives in quantities that shocked commanders on both sides. Every subsequent battle near Guadalcanal, the night surface actions off Savo Island, the carrier battles at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, the final Japanese withdrawal in February 1943, was influenced by the incomplete resolution of the August carrier battle. The untold impact was that Eastern Solomons created conditions for sustained combat rather than quick decision, turning the Solomons into the grinding attritional campaign that Japan could least afford, and that America's industrial superiority was best equipped to win. September 15, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch walked through the Naval Air Station at San Diego, observing young pilots practicing carrier landing approaches on the concrete runway marked to simulate a carrier deck. Thatch had fought at Midway in Eastern Solomons, had developed innovative fighter tactics, had survived when many of his squadron mates had not. Now he was stateside, assigned to pass his combat experience to the next generation of naval aviators. What struck him immediately was how unprepared these young pilots were for actual combat. They had learned to fly competently, had mastered the technical skills of carrier aviation, but they lacked the instinctive reactions that only combat experience could provide. Thaig's challenge was finding ways to compress years of experience into weeks of training, knowing that every pilot who deployed without adequate preparation was likely to be killed during his first few combat missions. Across the Pacific at Kasumigara Air Base in Japan, Commander Minoru Genda faced a similar challenge with fewer resources and more desperate circumstances. Genda had commanded carrier air groups since 1939, had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood Japanese naval aviation's capabilities and limitations better than almost anyone. He had been reassigned to training duties after being wounded at Midway, and his assessment of the pilot training situation was grim. The experienced instructors who normally staffed the Naval Air Training Command had been pulled back to operational units to replace combat losses. The training curriculum had been compressed from 18 months to 12 months to get pilots into combat faster. The result was new pilots arriving at operational units with marginal skills, inadequate instrument flying capabilities, and virtually no understanding of combat tactics. Genda's reports warning that this would lead to catastrophic losses in future battles were acknowledged but not acted upon because the Japanese Navy had no alternative except to continue producing marginally trained pilots or accept even more severe pilot shortages. The pilot training differential between America and Japan was not yet apparent in September 1942, but would become increasingly stark over the next 2 years. American pilot training in 1942 consisted of approximately 245 flight hours before a pilot was certified as combat ready. This training included basic flight instruction, advanced carrier operations, gunnery practice, navigation, formation flying, and tactical doctrine. Upon reaching an operational squadron, new pilots received additional training from experienced pilots before being assigned to combat missions. The rotation system meant that roughly 25% of an operational squadron consisted of combat veterans who could mentor new pilots. This system was expensive, requiring large training infrastructures, deconsuming significant fuel and aircraft, but it produced pilots who had reasonable chances of surviving their early combat missions and learning from experience. Japanese pilot training in 1942 theoretically provided more flight hours than American training, with new pilots receiving 300 or more hours before assignment to operational units. However, this advantage was already eroding by late 1942 due to fuel shortages, instructor shortages, and pressure to accelerate production. More critically, Japanese doctrine did not rotate experienced pilots back to training duties as systematically as American doctrine. Experienced Japanese pilots remained with operational units until they were killed, captured, or too badly wounded to continue flying. This meant new pilots arriving at operational squadrons received less mentorship from veterans. It also meant that when experienced pilots were killed, as 60 had been at Eastern Solomons, their knowledge died with them, rather than being passed to the next generation. The system was producing diminishing returns, training fewer and less capable pilots, even as combat operations demanded more pilots with better skills. The specific case of fighter pilot training illustrated how the training differential would compound over time. American fighter pilots in training learned the thatch weave, a defensive tactic where two fighters covered each other through coordinated maneuvers that made it difficult for enemy fighters to attack either aircraft without exposing themselves to fire from the other. Though this tactic had been developed through combat experience at Coral Sea and Eastern Solomons, validated through training experiments, and then systematically taught to new pilots, Japanese fighter pilots learned traditional dogfighting tactics emphasizing individual aircraft maneuverability and pilot skill. These tactics worked well when Japanese pilots had superior experience and aircraft performance, but they required years of training to master and provided no systematic approach for less experienced pilots to survive against more experienced opponents. The result was that American fighter tactics improved the survival rate of inexperienced pilots, while Japanese tactics assumed pilots would gain experience through surviving multiple combats, an assumption that became increasingly untenable as pilot losses mounted. The mathematical reality of pilot attrition created an invisible but inexorable strategic advantage for America. Consider a simplified model. America produced 100 new carrier pilots per month. Japan produced 40 new carrier pilots per month. Combat operations consumed approximately 30 American pilots per month and 30 Japanese pilots per month through mid-1942. America gained 70 pilots per month net. Japan gained 10 pilots per month net. This differential meant that American pilot strength steadily increased, while Japanese pilot strength remained roughly constant. By mid-1943, American squadrons would have surplus pilots allowing rotation and rest. Japanese squadrons would be chronically under strength, forcing pilots to fly more sorties per day and increasing fatigue-related casualties. By mid-1944, American squadrons would include many pilots with multiple tours of combat experience. Japanese squadrons would increasingly consist of barely trained replacements led by a dwindling number of exhausted veterans. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons represented a critical inflection point in this pilot attrition dynamic. The loss of 60 experienced Japanese pilots in a single battle represented approximately 1.5 months of pilot production. More significantly, these were experienced pilots, men with hundreds of combat hours, intimate knowledge of their aircraft, understanding of American tactics developed through repeated engagements. Replacing them with new graduates from the training pipeline meant replacing experienced professionals with relative amateurs. The impact would not be immediately visible. Japanese air operations continued at roughly the same scale through late 1942. But the quality was declining. Experienced squadron commanders noticed that new pilots required more intensive supervision, made more errors, suffered higher casualty rates in their first few missions. The veteran pilots who survived had to work harder to compensate for their less capable squadron mates, increasing their own stress and fatigue. American pilot losses at Eastern Solomons, 23 pilots killed or missing, represented roughly 1 week of pilot production. The losses were significant but easily replaceable from the training pipeline. More importantly, several experienced pilots who survived the battle were rotated back to training assignments, where they passed their knowledge to new pilots. Lieutenant Wade McCluskey, who led the attack on Ryujo, would eventually train hundreds of pilots before the war ended. His survival multiplied his value to the American war effort, far beyond the tactical contributions he made in individual battles. Japanese naval aviation had no equivalent system. Surviving experienced pilots remained with operational units, continued flying combat missions, and were eventually killed. Their knowledge died with them, creating a progressive degradation of institutional expertise that would prove catastrophic by 1944. The invisible casualty of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons was Japanese naval aviation's long-term sustainability. The immediate battle results looked acceptable from Tokyo's perspective. 1 light carrier lost, American carrier damaged, pilot loss is heavy, but within acceptable parameters for a major engagement. What was not visible in August 1942 was that Eastern Solomons had accelerated pilot attrition beyond the rate that Japanese training infrastructure could sustainably replace. Every subsequent battle would deepen the pilot deficit. By the time Japanese commanders recognized the crisis, it would be too late to address through increased training, because building training infrastructure required years, and Japan had months at best, before pilot shortages became operationally crippling. The invisible casualty was not counted in after-action reports, not mentioned in dispatches, not memorialized on monuments. It was the slow death of Japanese naval aviation's expertise, killed 60 pilots at a time in battles that seemed tactically inconclusive, but were strategically decisive. The mathematics were inexorable. The outcome was inevitable. The only question was how long it would take before the invisible casualty became visible in the collapse of Japanese air operations. October the 24th, 1942. Staff officers in the Navy Department building in Washington studied reconnaissance photographs from Guadalcanal, showing the Japanese airfield now under American control and renamed Henderson Field. The photographs revealed extensive construction work, expanded runways, revetments for aircraft, fuel storage facilities, anti-aircraft positions. Then Henderson Field had become the critical strategic asset that justified the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Aircraft operating from Henderson could attack Japanese shipping within a 300-mile radius, interdicting the Tokyo Express supply runs, providing air cover for American naval operations, supporting ground forces fighting to expand the American perimeter. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had created the conditions allowing Henderson Field to be captured and held. Now, Henderson Field was creating new strategic realities that rippled across the entire Pacific theater. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, convened a strategic planning conference in early November to assess how the Guadalcanal campaign had altered Pacific war strategy. Then his staff presented analysis showing that Japanese naval aviation had suffered significantly higher losses than intelligence had initially estimated. The combined casualties from Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons totaled approximately 250 experienced pilots killed, roughly 15% of Japan's carrier-qualified pilot pool. Intelligence assessments suggested Japanese training pipelines were struggling to produce adequate replacements. This meant American carrier forces could expect to face progressively less experienced Japanese pilots in future engagements. King's conclusion was that America should pursue an aggressive carrier-focused strategy, accepting short-term risks to inflict maximum attrition on Japanese air groups. The strategy would only work if American carriers could survive the next 6 to 12 months of combat without catastrophic losses, but intelligence suggested the window was narrowing, during which Japanese pilot quality would provide them with significant advantages. The strategic reassessment extended to American carrier construction and deployment priorities. The Essex-class carrier program had been authorized before the war, but was still in early construction phases. The first Essex-class carrier would not be operational until late 1943 at the earliest. Until then, American carrier strength would consist of the pre-war carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, once repaired, and the newer but smaller carriers Wasp and Hornet. This limited carrier strength meant that every battle risked significant portions of total American carrier capability. The loss of any single carrier would severely impact strategic flexibility. Therefore, carrier operations needed to be carefully managed, aggressive enough to inflict attrition on Japanese forces, cautious enough to avoid catastrophic American losses. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had demonstrated that this balance was achievable but difficult. Imperial Naval Headquarters in Tokyo conducted its own strategic reassessment in November, reaching conclusions that mirrored American analysis but with more pessimistic implications. The combined fleet had lost 3 carriers, sunk, and 2 carriers damaged in the 6 months between December 1941 and August 1942. Carrier construction would replace these losses by late 1943, but the replacement carriers would have inexperienced air groups. More critically, every major engagement was consuming irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Guadalcanal campaign was proving far more costly than anticipated, consuming aircraft, ships, and supplies at unsustainable rates. Japanese staff officers calculated that continuing operations at current intensity would exhaust naval aviation's combat capability by mid-1943. Withdrawing from Guadalcanal was politically unacceptable but militarily sensible. The debate between political and military logic would paralyze Japanese decision-making for months, during which time the situation would deteriorate beyond recovery. The production mathematics underlying the strategic assessments revealed structural imbalances that the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had illuminated but not created. American aircraft production in 1942 totaled approximately 47,000 aircraft across all types. Japanese production totaled approximately 8,500 aircraft. The roughly 5-to-1 production ratio meant that America could sustain casualty rates that would be catastrophic for Japan. At Eastern Solomons, the aircraft loss ratio was approximately 2 Japanese aircraft lost for every American aircraft lost. This seemed like a Japanese disadvantage, but actually it was far better than the production ratio. If battles continued at similar loss ratios, Japan would run out of aircraft before America, but not as quickly as production rates suggested. The critical factor was pilot losses, where casualty ratios were roughly 3 Japanese pilots lost for every American pilot lost. This ratio was worse than sustainable, given that Japan was producing fewer than half as many pilots as America annually. The ripple effect extended beyond naval aviation to affect ground operations, submarine warfare, and logistics throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese submarines that had been designated for offensive operations against American carriers were instead committed to supply runs to Guadalcanal, a mission for which they were poorly suited and which consumed fuel and maintenance capacity without achieving significant military results. American submarines were released from defensive positions near Hawaii and instead sent to patrol Japanese convoy routes, beginning the commerce warfare campaign that would eventually strangle Japan's economy. Surface warships on both sides were committed to Guadalcanal-related operations when they might have been more effectively employed elsewhere. The resource commitment to Guadalcanal created a gravitational pull that drew forces from across the Pacific into a single theater, creating opportunities for offensive operations in other theaters that went unexploited because forces were unavailable. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific campaign benefited unexpectedly from the Guadalcanal commitment. Japanese forces in New Guinea that had been advancing toward Port Moresby were starved of reinforcements and supplies because shipping was diverted to Guadalcanal. American forces in New Guinea received priority for air support because Guadalcanal demonstrated the value of air superiority in jungle campaigns. The parallel campaigns created a pincer effect that Japanese strategists recognized but could not effectively counter because they lacked sufficient forces to adequately resource both theaters. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons had not been intended to create this strategic dynamic, but its outcome, forcing Japanese carriers to withdraw without achieving decisive victory, had cascaded into consequences that affected military operations across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The long-term implications for American strategic planning included fundamental reassessments of how carriers should be employed in future operations. The pre-war expectation had been that carriers would support battleship actions or conduct independent raids against enemy positions. Combat experience through mid-1942 had demonstrated that carriers were the decisive weapon in Pacific naval warfare, and that battleships were increasingly relegated to supporting roles. This recognition accelerated the shift toward carrier-centered fleet organization, where battleships screened carriers rather than carriers screening battleships. The organizational changes would take months to fully implement, but were already apparent in task force compositions by late 1942. American doctrine was evolving rapidly, now incorporating lessons from each battle and disseminating those lessons through training and tactical publications. Japanese doctrine evolved more slowly, partly because institutional resistance to change was stronger, partly because the lessons being learned were fundamentally discouraging. Japanese naval aviation had been the world's finest in December 1941, better trained, more experienced, equipped with excellent aircraft, and employing sound tactical doctrine. 6 months of combat had revealed that these advantages were temporary and exhaustible. Pilot quality was declining as veterans were killed and replacements arrived with marginal training. Aircraft quality was remaining constant, while American aircraft improved through rapid design iterations. Tactical doctrine was proving inadequate against opponents who employed radar and radio-directed combat air patrols. The ripple effect of Eastern Solomons was forcing Japanese commanders to confront realities they preferred to deny: that the war was not going according to plan, that American forces were more capable than anticipated, that the strategic initiative was shifting from offense to defense. By early 1943, Japanese naval strategy would focus on preserving forces for the decisive battle that doctrine demanded, but circumstances made increasingly unlikely. The ripples from Eastern Solomons would continue spreading until they merged with ripples from other battles into a wave that would overwhelm Japanese defenses and end the war. June 19, 1944. Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of his flagship during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, watching American aircraft returning from strikes against Japanese carriers. The battle, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was demonstrating with brutal clarity how completely American naval aviation had achieved superiority over Japanese forces. American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 10-1. Japanese attacks against American carriers were being intercepted and destroyed before reaching their targets. The battle's outcome was never in doubt. What Spruance recognized as he watched the one-sided combat was that this dominance had not appeared suddenly. It had been built gradually through 2 years of battles that had progressively eroded Japanese pilot quality while American pilot quality improved. The foundation had been laid at places like Eastern Solomons, in battles that seemed inconclusive at the time, but whose cumulative effects were now visible in the overwhelming American superiority that characterized mid-1944 carrier operations. Veterans of the Eastern Solomons who survived to see the war's end reflected on the battle with perspectives shaped by hindsight and personal experience. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin, who had led the attack on Ryujo, was interviewed in 1946 about his experiences. His reflection was measured. "We thought we'd made a mistake attacking the wrong target. We wanted the big carriers and got a small one instead. But looking back, any carrier we sank was one less carrier the Japanese had. They couldn't replace carriers or pilots fast enough. We could. That's what really mattered, not whether we sank the right carrier in August 1942, but whether we maintained pressure that kept grinding down their capabilities faster than they could rebuild them." This perspective, that battles should be evaluated by cumulative effects rather than immediate outcomes, would become the dominant historical interpretation of Eastern Solomons. Japanese survivors offer different but complementary perspectives. Captain Tameichi Hara, who commanded destroyers during the Solomons campaign, wrote in his post-war memoir about the psychological impact of battles like Eastern Solomons, "We fought bravely, we sank ships, we shot down aircraft. But after each battle, we seemed weaker while the Americans seemed stronger. It was like fighting the ocean. You could win individual engagements against waves, but the tide always came in eventually." This recognition of asymmetric attrition, that Japan was winning tactical exchanges while losing strategic campaigns, permeated Japanese naval veterans' post-war writings. They understood, in retrospect, that battles like Eastern Solomons represented Japan's last opportunities to achieve favorable outcomes before American industrial superiority became overwhelming. Modern strategic analysts examining the Battle of the Eastern Solomons through 21st century perspectives focus on factors that contemporary participants barely understood: the role of signals intelligence in shaping American decisions, the impact of radar on defensive operations, and the significance of pilot training differentials, the logistics constraints that limited Japanese options. These factors were partially recognized in 1942, but their full implications only became apparent through historical analysis. Academic debates about who won Eastern Solomons generally conclude that the question itself is poorly formulated. Neither side achieved its maximum objectives. Both sides inflicted damage on the other. The battle's significance lay not in immediate outcomes, but in how it influenced subsequent events. By this metric, Eastern Solomons represented a strategic success for America because it disrupted Japanese operations at Guadalcanal during the critical period when American forces were establishing themselves ashore. The casualty figures from Eastern Solomons, approximately 250 American personnel killed, 650 Japanese personnel killed, represented individual tragedies that the historical analysis sometimes obscured. Behind each number was a person with family, friends, dreams, and potential futures that were destroyed. The monuments and memorials created after the war attempted to honor these individuals, though inevitably the passage of time would reduce personal stories to names on plaques. Veterans' reunions in later decades brought together survivors from both sides, men who had tried to kill each other in 1942, but who shared bonds of combat experience that transcended nationality. These reunions revealed common threads. All had been terrified during battle, all had lost friends, and all questioned whether their individual actions mattered in the context of history. The shared recognition of war's costs created understanding between former enemies that politics alone could never achieve. The historical significance of Eastern Solomons continued evolving as new documents were declassified and new analytical frameworks emerged. The revelation in the 1970s that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese communications transformed understanding of how the battle was planned and conducted. What had appeared to be fortunate American decisions were revealed to have been based on solid intelligence. Japanese decisions that seemed inexplicable were revealed to have been based on assumptions that American codes were secure, assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. The intelligence dimension added new complexity to historical interpretation, raising questions about whether battles could be considered fair when one side possessed information, advantages of which the other side was completely unaware. These questions had no simple answers, but highlighted how technology, in this case cryptanalysis, could provide decisive advantages that traditional measures of military power did not capture. The larger context of the Pacific War required viewing Eastern Solomons as one battle in a 3.5-year campaign, where outcomes accumulated over time. The battle prevented Japanese seizure of Guadalcanal, allowing American forces to establish Henderson Field, which enabled American air superiority in the Southern Solomons, which allowed American ground forces to be supplied and reinforced, and which led to eventual American control of the Solomons, which provided bases for advancing up the island chain toward Rabaul and eventually the Philippines. Each link in this chain was contingent on previous links. Breaking any single link would have disrupted the entire progression. Eastern Solomons represented one link, not the most dramatic, not the most costly, but nonetheless essential to the overall chain. This perspective suggested that battles should be evaluated not by dramatic moments or clear victories, but by whether they achieved the strategic purposes for which they were fought, even if those purposes were only partially achieved. The measure of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, assessed nearly 80 years after the event, was that it represented naval warfare at a crucial transitional moment. Carrier aviation was proving decisive, but neither side yet fully understood how to employ carriers optimally. Radar was providing advantages, but doctrine for exploiting radar was still developing. Pilot quality was becoming critical, but training pipelines were inadequate on both sides. The battle captured all these dynamics in a compressed time frame where decisions made under uncertainty, with incomplete information, by commanders under immense stress, determined outcomes that would ripple through years of subsequent operations. The participants understood they were fighting for immediate objectives, preventing or enabling Japanese seizure of Guadalcanal. They could not have understood that they were also establishing patterns of carrier warfare that would persist through the war's conclusion. Rome, the final measure was simpler and more profound than strategic analysis could capture. Young men fought in this battle. Some survived, many died. All were changed by the experience. The survivors carried memories of violence, loss, fear, and occasional triumph for the rest of their lives. The dead were remembered by families, honored in ceremonies, gradually fading from living memory as generations passed. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons mattered because human beings fought it, suffered through it, died in it. The strategic significance and historical interpretation were important for understanding the war's course, but the human experience was ultimately what gave the battle meaning. War is not abstract movements of forces on maps. It is individual people making choices under extreme stress, experiencing terror and courage, and living or dying based on factors partly within and partly beyond their control. The measure of Eastern Solomons, in the end, was measured in the lives of those who fought it, what they risked, what they lost, what they preserved, and what their sacrifices meant for the world that emerged from the war's conclusion. That measure transcended statistics, exceeded strategic analysis, and endured long after the last ships had departed and the last veterans had passed away.